Chapter 7, Unit 7, Industrial and Economic Development Patterns and Processes. 7.1, The Industrial Revolution, Origins and Diffusion. Let's set the scene. It's the mid-1700s, and the entire world runs on muscle. Human muscle, animal muscle, and the slow grind of water wheels. Then, in a relatively small corner of northwestern England, something shifts. A new kind of power enters the world, and within a century, it rewires every system of human life on the planet, where people live, what they do, how goods move, and who holds power. That shift is the Industrial Revolution, and understanding it deeply is your foundation for everything else in Unit 7. What the Industrial Revolution actually was. The Industrial Revolution refers to the transition from agrarian, cottage-based economies to urban, factory-based economies, beginning in Britain around 1760 and spreading globally through the 19th and into the 20th century. Notice the College Board phrasing here. They want you to frame this as a transition, not just the invention of machines. It was a fundamental reorganization of production, labor, and spatial patterns. On the AP exam, if a question asks you to define the Industrial Revolution, your answer needs to include 3 ideas: mechanization of production, the shift from rural to urban economic activity, and the use of fossil fuels, especially coal, as a primary energy source. Think of it this way: before industrialization, making a shirt meant a weaver in a cottage spinning thread by hand, one item at a time. After industrialization, a single factory with steam-powered looms could produce thousands of shirts a day. That change in scale is the heart of what you need to understand. Why Britain first? This is one of the most common FRQ prompts you'll encounter, and students consistently lose points by giving vague answers like, Britain had resources. You need to be specific. Britain's head start came from a convergence of geographic, political, and economic advantages. Geographically, Britain had enormous coal and iron ore deposits, coal for energy, iron for building machines, located conveniently close to each other in regions like South Wales, the Midlands, and Yorkshire. Britain also had an extensive river network, and crucially, no point in England is more than about 70 miles from navigable water. That matters because moving heavy industrial goods by land was brutally expensive before railroads existed. Politically, Britain had a stable constitutional monarchy that protected private property and allowed entrepreneurs to profit from their inventions. The patent system encouraged innovation. Colonies across the globe provided both raw materials and captive markets for manufactured goods. This connection to colonialism is something the AP exam loves to test, and it links directly back to Unit 2's discussion of colonization and core periphery relationships. Economically, Britain had a well-developed banking system and access to capital, meaning investors could fund factories. And perhaps most importantly, an enclosure movement had pushed rural peasants off common agricultural lands, flooding cities with a desperate, cheap labor supply. That's your labor force for the factories. Remember, industrialization needs machines, fuel, capital, and labor. Britain had all 4 concentrated in one place at the same time. The diffusion of industrialization. Now here's where geographic thinking takes center stage. The Industrial Revolution did not spread randomly. It diffused through a combination of contagious diffusion and hierarchical diffusion, terms you learned back in Unit 1. Industrialization spread first to places with cultural and economic ties to Britain, Belgium and France in the early 1800s, then to Germany, and later to the northeastern United States. Notice the pattern. These are all places with existing trade relationships, cultural connections, Protestant work ethics that historians like Max Weber linked to capitalist enterprise and their own coal and iron deposits. When you think about the U.S. case, picture the industrial triangle anchored by cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit. Why there? Because the Great Lakes provided cheap water transport, the Appalachian coalfields were nearby, and iron ore could be shipped from Minnesota's Iron Range via the lake. Geography is always doing work in these explanations. On the exam, if you're given a map and asked why industrialization concentrated in a particular region, your instinct should be to look for coal, iron, water access, and labor supply. The Rostow model. Know it cold. The AP exam will absolutely ask you about Walt Rostow's stages of economic growth model, which uses industrialization as its backbone. Rostow proposed 5 stages: traditional society, preconditions for takeoff, drive to maturity, and high mass consumption. Britain in the 1760s represented his takeoff stage, the moment when industrialization becomes self-sustaining and economic growth accelerates dramatically. Here's the critical exam trap. Students often confuse Rostow's model with a description of what did happen versus what Rostow prescribes should happen. Rostow was writing in 1960 during the Cold War, and his model was explicitly meant to argue that developing countries could follow the same Western capitalist path rather than turning to communism. Critics, particularly dependency theorists like Andre Gunder Frank, argue that the model ignores how colonialism kept peripheral nations underdeveloped so that core nations could industrialize. That critique connects directly to Wallerstein's world systems theory, which you'll encounter more deeply later in Unit 7, but you should already be threading these concepts together. Connections to other units. You should never think of this topic as an island. The Industrial Revolution is the engine behind nearly every major geographic pattern in the course. The urbanization processes you studied in Unit 6, the growth of cities, the development of urban hierarchies, the emergence of manufacturing zones are direct consequences of industrialization. The demographic transition model from Unit 2, showing falling death rates followed by falling birth rates, was first observed in industrializing Britain and Western Europe. The environmental consequences you'll explore in Unit 5, from air pollution to resource extraction to deforestation, trace their origins here, and the global patterns of development and inequality in Unit 7 itself, the difference between core, semi-periphery, and periphery, are fundamentally shaped by who industrialized first and who was prevented from doing so. The most common MCQ traps. Let me flag 2 traps that trip up students repeatedly. First, don't assume that industrialization always followed the same path everywhere. Japan's Meiji Restoration in the 1860s shows state-directed industrialization rather than the private entrepreneur model of Britain, and that difference matters for understanding comparative development. Second, don't confuse where industrialization began with why it spread. Britain was first because of a unique combination of factors. Industrialization spread to other regions because of technology transfer, capital investment, and often colonial relationships. These are different questions requiring different answers. As you build your understanding of industrial origins, hold on to this geographic instinct. Location matters because of what resources it contains, how connected it is to other places, and what historical processes have shaped it. And that thinking will carry you perfectly into our next discussion of how industrial geography shapes economic patterns in the modern world. 7.2 Economic sectors: primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quinary. The big picture, how economies are organized. Imagine you're sitting down for your morning coffee. Think about everything that went into that cup. Someone grew the coffee beans, someone roasted and packaged them, someone sold them to you, someone designed the supply chain app that tracked the shipment, and a government official somewhere set the agricultural trade policy that made the whole thing possible. Congratulations. You just walked through all 5 economic sectors before 8 a.m. That's exactly the framework we're building today, and it's one of the most tested concepts in all of Unit 7. The economic sector model divides all human economic activity into 5 categories, based on what kind of work is being done and how far removed that work is from raw natural resources. The College Board loves this framework because it connects beautifully to development, globalization, and geographic patterns, so understanding it deeply means points on both the multiple choice and the FRQ. Primary sector, where it all begins. The primary sector is the extraction of raw materials directly from the natural environment. We're talking agriculture, fishing, forestry, mining, and quarrying. If you're pulling something out of the ground, the water, or growing it from the earth, that's primary sector activity. Think of subsistence farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, commercial wheat farmers on the Great Plains, or copper miners in Chile's Atacama Desert. Here's the crucial connection for the exam. The percentage of a country's workforce employed in the primary sector is one of the strongest indicators of its level of development. Less developed countries, what the College Board calls countries with lower levels of development, have a high proportion of workers in the primary sector. As a country develops, that percentage drops. This is the essence of the Clark-Fisher model, sometimes called the sector model of economic change, and you absolutely need to be able to describe and interpret it. Picture a simple line graph with time or development level on the x-axis and percentage of workforce on the y-axis. You draw 3 curves, primary, secondary, and tertiary, that shift over time. Early in development, the primary sector line sits high and dominates. As industrialization kicks in, the secondary sector rises and the primary sector falls. Eventually, in post-industrial economies, the tertiary sector crests and becomes dominant while the primary sector is relatively small. If you're asked to draw this on an FRQ, label your axes clearly, Label each curve, and make sure your curves peak at different times from left to right. Secondary sector, transformation and manufacturing. The secondary sector takes raw materials and transforms them into finished or semi-finished goods. Manufacturing, construction, and processing all live here. A steel mill turning iron ore into steel beams, that's secondary. A factory in Guangzhou assembling smartphones, secondary. A textile mill in Bangladesh turning raw cotton into clothing, also secondary. The secondary sector is the engine of industrialization, and it's deeply connected to the location theories you studied in Unit 7.1. Weber's least cost theory, for instance, is all about where secondary sector industries decide to locate. The secondary sector is also where you see the concept of value added. Raw cotton is worth a certain amount, but cotton fabric is worth more, and a finished shirt is worth even more. Each transformation adds value. This is why countries and corporations invest so heavily in manufacturing. It multiplies the economic value of raw inputs. On the exam, watch out for a common trap. Students sometimes confuse the secondary sector with the tertiary sector when they think about things like food processing or oil refining. If physical material is being transformed, it's secondary, even if it seems modern. That oil refinery, secondary sector, not tertiary. Tertiary sector, the service economy. The tertiary sector is all about services, activities that don't produce a physical good, but provide value through doing something for someone else. Retail, transportation, banking, healthcare, education, tourism, and hospitality all belong here. When you go to a restaurant, the cook is doing secondary sector work, transforming ingredients, but the server, the host, and the manager are all doing tertiary sector work. In post-industrial economies like the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe, the tertiary sector employs the vast majority of workers. This shift away from manufacturing toward services is called deindustrialization, and it's a major theme in Unit 7. Cities that once thrived on manufacturing, think Detroit, Pittsburgh, or the Rust Belt broadly, experienced significant economic disruption when factory jobs moved offshore or became automated, leaving a workforce that needed to transition into service industries. Quaternary sector, knowledge and information. Here's where the model gets more nuanced, and where the exam likes to test precision. The quaternary sector involves knowledge-based economic activities, research, information technology, financial services at a high level, consulting, and education as a sector of innovation rather than basic instruction. Think of a data scientist at Google, a research biologist at a pharmaceutical company, or a software engineer designing new algorithms. The quaternary sector is overwhelmingly concentrated in the world's most developed cities and regions: Silicon Valley, London's financial district, Tokyo, Singapore. This geographic concentration connects directly to the concepts of agglomeration and growth poles from earlier in the unit. Quaternary industries cluster together because they depend on highly educated workers, robust infrastructure, and the cross-pollination of ideas that only happens when brilliant people are physically near each other. Quinary sector, the apex decision-makers. The quinary sector is the smallest and most elite tier. It refers to the highest-level decision-making and leadership in organizations, including top executive roles in corporations, senior government officials, NGO leadership, and some frameworks include academics who shape knowledge at the highest levels. These are the people setting policy and strategy, not just executing it. Think of the CEO of a multinational corporation or the Secretary General of the United Nations. The quinary sector is tiny in terms of raw employment numbers, but its decisions ripple across all other sectors and across the globe on the AP exam. You may encounter it in a multiple-choice context where you need to correctly identify which sector a described role belongs to, and confusing quaternary and quinary is the most common error here. Remember, quaternary is broadly about knowledge work and information. Quinary is specifically about the apex leadership and decision-making tier. Putting it all together, exam strategy. The most common FRQ trap with this topic is misidentifying which sector a described activity belongs to. Always ask yourself, is this extracting something from nature, primary, transforming a physical material, secondary, providing a service, tertiary, generating or applying knowledge, quaternary, or making top-level institutional decisions, quinary? Work through that hierarchy explicitly, especially on FRQs, because rubric readers are looking for precise terminology. This framework also connects directly to topics in Unit 1, how development shapes population patterns, Unit 2, demographic transition and development levels, Unit 6, urban economic structure, and throughout Unit 7 as you explore industrial location, development theories, and globalization. Every time you see a question about a country's level of development, economic structure, or workforce patterns, the 5 sectors are lurking just beneath the surface. Now that you understand how economies are organized by sector, you're perfectly set up to explore where those industries decide to locate, which is exactly what Weber's industrial location theory is all about. 7.3 Weber's least cost theory of industrial location. The core question, why here and not there? Imagine you're opening a factory. You could put it anywhere, a cornfield in Iowa, the outskirts of Detroit, a coastal port in New Jersey. So how do you decide? That's exactly the question Alfred Weber sat down to answer in 1909, and his answer became one of the most testable models in all of AP human geography. Weber's least cost theory says, simply, that a rational industrialist will locate a factory at the point where the total costs of production are minimized, not maximized profits, minimized costs. Keep that framing in mind because the AP exam will absolutely try to swap those two things on you. Weber identified 3 factors that determine where that least cost location ends up: transportation costs, labor costs, and agglomeration. He ranked them in that order of importance, and the exam expects you to know that ranking cold. Transportation costs and the weight-loss ratio. Transportation costs are Weber's primary and dominant factor. The logic is intuitive. It costs money to move raw materials to your factory and finished goods to your market, so you want to minimize the total distance those materials travel, but weighted by how heavy or bulky they are. This is where the concept of the material index comes in, and this is a formula you absolutely need to know for the exam. The material index equals the weight of the localized raw materials divided by the weight of the finished product. Written out, material index equals weight of inputs divided by weight of finished product. Here's why that ratio matters so much. If the material index is greater than 1, your raw materials are heavier than your finished product, meaning you lose weight during manufacturing. Weber called these weight-losing industries, and they should locate near their raw material sources. Think about iron and steel production. You need enormous quantities of iron ore and coal to produce a relatively small amount of steel. Hauling all that ore to a distant market would be enormously expensive. So historically, steel mills planted themselves right next to the mines in places like Pittsburgh, which sat at the confluence of coal fields and iron ore shipping routes. If the material index equals 1 or is less than 1, you have a weight-gaining industry. Your product is heavier than your inputs, or roughly equal. These industries should locate near their market. A classic example is bottled beverages. Coca-Cola syrup is light and easy to ship, but finished bottles of soda are heavy and bulky. That's why Coca-Cola ships syrup concentrate to local bottling plants near consumers rather than bottling everything in Atlanta and trucking glass bottles across the country. Now here's a common MCQ trap. Students confuse localized and ubiquitous raw materials. Localized materials are found only in specific places: coal, iron ore, timber. Ubiquitous materials are available everywhere, like water or air. Weber's formula only counts localized materials in the numerator because ubiquitous inputs don't affect the location decision. You can get them anywhere. If an exam question gives you a scenario where water is a major input, don't include it in your material index calculation. Drawing Weber's locational triangle. For the AP exam, you need to be able to describe and interpret Weber's locational triangle, and in a pinch, sketch it. Picture 3 points on a map. 1 is your raw material source, let's call it point R. 1 is your second raw material source if there are 2, point R2, and 1 is your market, point M. The least cost location sits somewhere inside or at the vertices of the triangle formed by those 3 points, pulled toward whichever point has the heaviest weight in the calculation. Think of it like a tug of war. Each corner of the triangle is pulling the factory toward itself. The heavier the materials at a given source, the stronger the pull toward that corner. If your raw materials are extremely heavy and weight-losing, the factory gets dragged close to point R. If the finished product is heavy, the market pulls it toward M. The factory lands wherever the forces balance out. Weber called this the point of minimum transport cost, and it forms the theoretical foundation before labor and agglomeration modify it. Labor costs and the critical isodapane. Once you've identified the point of minimum transport cost, Weber said to ask, is there a cheaper labor pool somewhere nearby that could offset the extra transportation cost of moving away from the ideal transport point? This is where isodapanes come in, and yes, the AP exam has used that word directly. An isodapane is a line connecting all points of equal transportation cost above the minimum. Picture concentric rings spreading outward from your optimal transport point, each ring representing $1 additional per unit of additional transport cost. If you find a labor source where the savings on wages exceed the additional transportation costs, meaning the labor pool falls inside the relevant isodapane, it's rational to relocate there. The isodapane where labor savings exactly equal additional transport costs is called the critical isodapane. If the cheap labor is inside the critical isodapane, move the factory. If it's outside, stay put. Agglomeration and deglomeration. The third factor, agglomeration, describes the cost savings that come from clustering with other industries. When factories group together, they share infrastructure, labor pools, supplier networks, and specialized services. Think of Silicon Valley's tech ecosystem or Detroit's historical auto industry cluster. Weber recognized that these external economies of scale can pull industries toward existing industrial centers even when transport costs might otherwise push them elsewhere. The opposite force, deglomeration, occurs when an area becomes too congested, rents rise, wages climb, traffic slows shipments. This pushes firms to disperse. You should know both terms and understand that agglomeration dominates early in an industry's growth, while deglomeration can set in as that cluster matures. Common traps and cross-unit connections. The most dangerous MCQ trap on Weber is forgetting the sequence. Transport costs first, labor second, agglomeration third. Weber never said they're equally weighted. Another trap is assuming that the least cost location is always the most profitable location. That's Lausch's profit maximization model, a different framework entirely. For FRQ scoring, expect rubric points for correctly identifying whether an industry is weight losing or weight gaining, applying the material index formula with numbers they give you, and explaining the role of isodapanes in the labor cost decision. Weber connects powerfully to other units. Unit 2's discussion of industrial cities and urbanization, Unit 6's treatment of urban land use and industrial zones, and Unit 7's broader conversation about deindustrialization and the shift of manufacturing to the global south, where cheap labor has repeatedly pulled factories outside the critical isodapane of their original locations. With Weber's framework firmly in hand, you're ready to explore how the global economy has evolved well beyond his 1909 model, and why understanding its limitations is just as important as understanding its strengths. 7.4 Agglomeration, Economies and Industrial Clusters. Why do companies cluster together? Here's something that might seem counterintuitive at first. Competing businesses often benefit from being close to each other rather than far apart. Think about why car dealerships line up along the same stretch of road in most American cities, or why you find dozens of tech startups all crammed into the same few zip codes in Silicon Valley. That phenomenon, firms choosing to locate near one another, is the heart of what we call agglomeration economies, and it's one of the most testable concepts in all of Unit 7. Agglomeration economies are the cost savings and productivity gains that firms experience when they locate near other firms, especially in the same or related industries. The word agglomeration simply means clustering together, and the economies part refers to economic benefits, specifically savings. When College Board asks you about agglomeration, they want you to demonstrate that you understand why clustering happens, what kinds of agglomeration exist, and what the spatial results look like on the landscape. The two types, localization versus urbanization economies. The AP exam will absolutely test your ability to distinguish between the two main types of agglomeration economies, and students mix these up constantly, so pay close attention here. Localization economies occur when firms in the same industry cluster together in a specific place. The benefits flow specifically from industry concentration. Think of Hollywood and the film industry, or Detroit historically and auto manufacturing, or Nashville and the music industry. When dozens of film studios cluster in Los Angeles, they all share access to a specialized labor pool of actors, directors, and cinematographers. They share suppliers of cameras, lighting, and set design, and they benefit from the proximity of industry knowledge and informal information sharing. A costume designer in Hollywood can work for multiple studios. A specialized parts supplier can serve many auto factories efficiently. These savings exist because of industry-specific concentration, that's localization. Urbanization economies, on the other hand, are the cost savings that come simply from being located in a large city, regardless of what industry you're in. A law firm, a restaurant, a tech startup, and a publishing house all benefit from a city's shared infrastructure, its transportation networks, its large and diverse labor pool, its financial services, its universities, and its market. New York City generates urbanization economies for nearly every kind of firm, because the sheer size and density of the city creates efficiencies. The key distinction to burn into your memory: localization is industry-specific clustering. Urbanization is city-size clustering. On an MCQ, If the question emphasizes one industry piling into one place, you're almost certainly looking at localization. If the question talks about diverse firms all benefiting from a big metropolitan area, that's urbanization. Industrial clusters and Alfred Marshall's industrial districts. The College Board also expects you to understand the concept of an industrial cluster, which is essentially the geographic manifestation of agglomeration. An industrial cluster is a geographic concentration of interconnected businesses, suppliers, and associated institutions in a particular field. Alfred Marshall, a 19th century economist whose ideas are very much alive in this course, described what he called industrial districts, specialized regions where an entire local culture and economy grows up around a particular industry. Marshall identified 3 key sources of benefit in these districts: access to a specialized labor market, access to specialized inputs and suppliers, and knowledge spillovers, the informal sharing of ideas and innovations just from workers and firms being close enough to talk to each other at lunch. That last one, knowledge spillovers, is particularly important for the exam. In the modern knowledge economy, innovation often happens when people bump into each other, share half-formed ideas, and build on each other's work. Silicon Valley isn't just a place with tech companies, it's a place where the concentration of talent means that a software engineer at a coffee shop might overhear a conversation that sparks a billion-dollar idea. Geographers call this agglomeration of innovation, and it helps explain why high-tech industries remain so geographically concentrated, even in an era of remote work and digital communication. Drawing and interpreting the model. For the AP exam, you should be able to sketch and interpret a simple diagram showing how agglomeration relates to firm location decisions. Picture a graph with geographic space along the horizontal axis and costs or revenues along the vertical axis. As more firms cluster in a location, average costs for each firm tend to fall initially. That's the agglomeration economy at work. However, if too many firms crowd into one place, costs eventually rise again due to congestion, rising land prices, and competition for labor. These are called agglomeration diseconomies. The curve forms a U-shape for costs, or an inverted U-shape if you're plotting benefits. The sweet spot, the trough of that cost curve, represents the optimal cluster size. This concept of diseconomies is a trap question favorite. The exam may describe a firm moving away from a crowded cluster and ask why. The answer isn't that agglomeration stopped working. It's that diseconomies set in and the cluster became too large. Connections across the course. This topic connects powerfully to several other units you've studied. Weber's least cost theory from earlier in Unit 7 establishes where a single firm locates based on minimizing transportation costs, labor costs, and agglomeration. Weber actually included agglomeration as one of his distorting forces, a reason a firm might not locate at the absolute cost minimizing point, but instead shift toward a cluster of related firms if the savings are sufficient. You should also connect agglomeration to Unit 6's discussion of urban land use and bid rent theory. Industrial clusters create high-demand zones that drive up land rents in the way that commercial activity does in city centers. And stepping back to Unit 2, the global distribution of industrial clusters reflects patterns of development, since agglomeration economies tend to be self-reinforcing. Rich clusters attract more firms, which attract more workers, which attract more suppliers, deepening the gap between core and periphery regions, a direct link to world systems theory. The most common exam traps. 2 traps appear on this topic more than any others. First, do not confuse agglomeration economies with economies of scale. Economies of scale are internal to a single firm. They happen when one company gets bigger and its per-unit costs fall. Agglomeration economies are external. They come from the firm's relationships with other firms in the surrounding environment. Second, do not assume that all industrial clustering is the same type. Always ask yourself, is this clustering industry-specific, localization, or city-size dependent, urbanization? That distinction is worth points on both MCQ and FRQ sections. With agglomeration now firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to examine how these clustering forces and industrial location decisions play out across different types of economies and stages of development, which is exactly where we're headed next. 7.5 Deindustrialization and the Rust Belt. What is deindustrialization, and why should you care? Let's start with a picture. Imagine a massive steel mill, smokestacks, molten metal, thousands of workers on shift rotations around the clock. Now imagine that same mill 30 years later, windows shattered, weeds growing through the concrete floor, a chain-link fence keeping people out. That's deindustrialization in a single image, and it's one of the most consequential economic processes of the 20th century. For the AP exam, deindustrialization is defined as the process by which manufacturing activity declines as a proportion of a region's economic output, typically accompanied by factory closures, job losses, and population decline. Notice the precision there. It's not just that factories close, it's that industry shrinks relative to the rest of the economy, often as services and finance grow to fill the gap. The forces driving deindustrialization are interconnected, and the AP exam loves to ask you to untangle them. The biggest driver is the global shift of manufacturing toward lower-cost production regions. Think East Asia, Mexico, and Southeast Asia, enabled by improvements in transportation and communication technology. When a company can pay workers in Shenzhen a fraction of what it pays workers in Cleveland for the same task, the financial pressure to relocate is enormous. This connects directly to Unit 7's discussion of least cost theory and Weber's model. Labor costs are one of Weber's 3 key variables, and when labor cost differentials become large enough, they override transportation cost savings from staying near the market. That's an exam-ready connection right there. The Rust Belt, Geography and Characteristics. Now let's get specific, because the AP exam will absolutely ask about the Rust Belt by name. The Rust Belt refers to a region of the northeastern and midwestern United States, stretching roughly from Milwaukee and Chicago in the west through Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, and into upstate New York in the east. That was once the heartland of American heavy industry. Steel, automobiles, rubber, glass, and heavy machinery defined this region's economy through most of the 20th century. Cities like Pittsburgh and Detroit weren't just industrial, they were synonymous with industry. Detroit was the motor city, Pittsburgh was steel city. The name Rust Belt itself is a metaphor you should understand deeply, because the exam may ask you to interpret it. The rust refers both to the literal rusting of abandoned factory equipment and to the broader economic decay, unemployment, population loss, fiscal crises that swept through these cities as manufacturing left. The term emerged in the 1980s, and by that point cities like Detroit had already lost hundreds of thousands of residents over the preceding 2 decades. Population loss is a critical indicator here. When jobs disappear, people follow the jobs, leading to urban shrinkage, falling property values, declining tax revenues, and deteriorating public services. This is a self-reinforcing cycle, and being able to describe that cycle is exactly the kind of nuanced analysis that earns points on an FRQ. Causes, consequences, and the spatial logic. For the AP exam, you need to distinguish between the causes of deindustrialization and its consequences, because questions will test both. On the causes side, 3 forces stand out. First, globalization and trade liberalization agreements like NAFTA made it dramatically cheaper to move production to Mexico, where wages were lower and environmental regulations less stringent. Second, automation and technological change, robots and computer-controlled machinery, reduced the need for low-skill manufacturing labor, even within the United States. Third, the energy crisis of the 1970s raised production costs for energy-intensive industries like steel, accelerating the timeline for companies already considering relocation. The consequences unfold at multiple geographic scales, which is a classic AP human geography frame. At the urban scale, you see depopulation, urban blight, increased poverty rates, and what geographers call shrinking cities, a term the exam has used explicitly. At the regional scale, you see a shift in economic and political power toward the Sun Belt, the South and Southwest, which grew rapidly as both people and investment migrated there seeking cheaper land, lower taxes, and a warmer climate. At the national scale, the United States shifted from a manufacturing-based economy to one dominated by the service sector and knowledge economy, a transformation with enormous implications for income inequality and the geographic distribution of wealth. Key models and diagrams you must know. While there isn't a single graph unique to deindustrialization, the way the demographic transition model belongs to Unit 2, you need to be prepared to work with a few key visuals. One is the sector model of economic development, which divides economic activity into primary resource extraction, secondary, manufacturing, and tertiary services sectors. In a deindustrializing economy, you would show the secondary sector's share shrinking, while the tertiary sector's share grows. Sketch this as a pie chart or a stacked bar graph, and you have a tool to illustrate the concept precisely. A second important visual is a population change map of the Rust Belt. Be able to identify the pattern of population decline in manufacturing cities as distinct from growth patterns in Sunbelt cities. The AP exam frequently uses maps showing population change and asks you to explain the patterns using economic geography concepts. Common exam traps and how to avoid them. Here's where a lot of students drop points, so pay close attention. The first trap is confusing deindustrialization with economic decline in general. A region can deindustrialize while its overall economy grows, if service and tech sectors expand fast enough. Silicon Valley essentially replaced manufacturing with a knowledge economy. The Rust Belt's tragedy wasn't just deindustrialization, it was the failure to successfully transition to new economic sectors. That distinction matters on the exam. The second trap is assuming deindustrialization only happens in wealthy countries. It can occur anywhere a region loses its competitive manufacturing advantage. The question is always relative to other regions in the global system. Third, don't confuse the Rust Belt with the entire Midwest. Agricultural states like Iowa and Nebraska were never manufacturing dependent in the same way, so they didn't experience the same deindustrialization dynamics on FRQs. The most commonly rewarded points involve explaining the spatial logic of these changes. Why did manufacturing move there specifically? And what geographic factors, labor costs, transportation access, proximity to resources, government incentives, explain the new location? Always tie your answer back to a model or theory. Weber, Rostow's stages of growth, or the core periphery model all apply here and signal geographic thinking to the scorer. Connections across the course. Deindustrialization doesn't exist in isolation. It connects to Unit 6's treatment of urban land use and urban decline, particularly the concept of urban renewal and gentrification as responses to deindustrializing neighborhoods. It links to Unit 5's discussion of push and pull migration factors. Job loss is one of the most powerful economic push factors driving internal migration in the United States. And it ties to the broader development vocabulary of Unit 7, particularly the world systems theory idea that production shifts from core to semi-periphery regions as industries mature and seek cost savings. As you move into the next section on economic development indicators, keep the Rust Belt in mind as a real-world test case, a place where we can measure what development and decline actually look like in human terms, not just in abstract statistics. 7.6 Special Economic Zones, SEZ, and Export Processing Zones, EPZs. All right, let's talk about one of the most fascinating experiments in modern economic geography. The idea that a country can essentially draw a circle on a map, declare special rules inside that circle, and watch factories and foreign money come flooding in. That's the core of what special economic zones and export processing zones are all about. And once you understand the logic behind them, you'll see their fingerprints all over the global economy. What are SEZ and EPZs, and why do they exist? Let's start with the big picture. A special economic zone, or SEZ, is a designated geographic area within a country where business and trade laws differ from the rest of the country. Think of it like a different operating system running inside the same computer. The country has its standard rules, taxes, tariffs, labor regulations, environmental standards, and then inside the SEZ, many of those rules are loosened or eliminated entirely to attract foreign investment. The goal is simple: make it irresistible for multinational corporations to set up shop there. An export processing zone, or EPZ, is actually a specific type of SEZ. Here's the distinction the AP exam loves to test. All EPZs are SEZs, but not all SEZs are EPZs. An EPZ is specifically designed for manufacturing goods that will be exported, not sold domestically. The factory workers inside an EPZ are building products destined for foreign consumers, and in exchange the host country benefits from jobs, wages flowing into the local economy, and technology transfer. The broader category of SEZs can also include things like free trade zones, technology parks, and financial centers. So SED is the umbrella, and EPZ sits underneath it as a more narrowly defined version. The analogy I love here: imagine your city normally requires restaurants to follow 100 health and zoning regulations, but the mayor designates one block downtown as a food innovation district where the rules are dramatically relaxed to attract new experimental restaurants. That block is essentially an SEZ for the food industry. The city is betting that the energy and investment those restaurants bring will eventually spread outward. Why countries create them? The incentive package. What exactly do countries offer inside these zones? The package typically includes tax holidays, periods of zero or reduced corporate taxes that can last a decade or more. It includes exemptions from import and export tariffs, meaning companies can bring in raw materials and ship out finished goods without paying the usual customs duties. It often includes relaxed labor laws, which is a politically charged feature, lower minimum wages, restrictions on union organizing, and fewer worker protections. Environmental regulations are frequently softened as well, And governments often sweeten the deal further by building the physical infrastructure, roads, ports, power grids, telecommunications, right into the zone. For the AP exam, you need to understand why this works, from the perspective of a developing country. Many lower-income countries struggle with what economists call the investment threshold problem. Foreign companies see too much risk and too little infrastructure to justify moving in. SES lower that threshold by concentrating resources and guarantees into one manageable area. China is the gold standard example here. When Deng Xiaoping established China's first SEZs in 1980, Shenzhen being the most famous, Shenzhen was a small fishing village of about 30,000 people. Today it's a megacity of over 17 million, a tech and manufacturing powerhouse. That transformation happened because the SEZ made foreign investment feel safe and profitable. The geography of SEZ. Why location matters. Here's where your geographic instincts should kick in. SEZ are almost never placed randomly. They tend to cluster near ports and coastal areas for obvious reasons. Easy access to global shipping lanes. They also appear at border regions between countries where cross-border trade flows are already established. And they're placed in areas with an existing pool of low-cost labor, which is a key pull factor for labor-intensive manufacturing like textiles, electronics assembly, and footwear. The AP exam may ask you to interpret or sketch a diagram showing a country's industrial geography. You should be able to draw a simplified map showing a coastal SEZ connected by infrastructure corridors to major urban centers inland, with arrows indicating flows of raw material inputs coming in and finished goods exports going out. Label the port, the SEZ's boundary, the labor catchment area, and the capital city. That simple diagram tells the story of how SEZ plug a developing nation into global commodity chains. Connections to other units. Don't miss these links. This topic connects beautifully across the AP Human Geography curriculum. From Unit 6, recall the concept of agglomeration, the tendency of related industries to cluster together for mutual benefit. SEZ are essentially government-engineered agglomeration. They create the conditions for clustering artificially rather than waiting for organic market forces to do it over decades. From your earlier work on transnational corporations and commodity chains, SEZ are the on-ramps through which developing nations plug into those global networks. The FRQ might ask you to trace how a commodity moves from raw material to consumer, and an EPZ is likely somewhere in the middle of that chain. You should also connect SEZ to dependency theory versus modernization theory. Critics of SEZ argue, consistent with dependency theory, that these zones keep developing countries locked in a low-wage, low-value manufacturing role that benefits wealthy countries and corporations far more than local populations. Supporters counter, echoing modernization theory that SEZ are a necessary first step up the development ladder, providing capital, technology transfer, and workforce skills that eventually allow countries to climb toward higher-value industries. Common exam traps and edge cases. Here are the traps that catch students on the multiple-choice section. First, don't confuse an EPZ with a free trade zone. A free trade zone is primarily about trading goods, importing, warehousing, re-exporting without tariffs. An EPZ is about manufacturing goods for export. Second, students often assume SEZ always succeed, but the AP exam will sometimes present a scenario where an SEZ fails, usually because infrastructure was insufficient, the labor cost advantage evaporated as wages rose, or political instability scared away investors. Third, watch for questions about who benefits. SEZ primarily benefit foreign corporations, and secondarily the host country's urban working class through employment. Rural populations and domestic industries often see little direct benefit, and this inequality can appear in an FRQ context. For FRQ scoring, if you're asked to evaluate the effectiveness of an SEZ as a development strategy, the College Board wants to see you acknowledge both the growth it generates and the critiques around labor exploitation, environmental degradation, and uneven development. A one-sided answer will not earn full points. Wrapping up. Special economic zones are essentially a country's way of putting up a welcome investors sign with extra privileges attached, concentrated zones of modified capitalism designed to accelerate integration into the global economy. Whether you view them as brilliant development shortcuts or exploitative enclaves depends heavily on which theory of development you're applying, and the AP exam expects you to be fluent in both perspectives. With that foundation in place, we're ready to zoom out even further and examine how entire national economies measure and compare their levels of development, which takes us right into the indicators and indexes that define our next topic. 7.7 Measures of Development: GDP, GNP, GNI, and HDI. Why we measure development in the first place. Imagine you're a doctor and a patient walks in. Before you can treat them, you need to take their vitals, blood pressure, heart rate, temperature. The numbers don't tell you everything about that person's life, but they give you a baseline, a starting point for diagnosis. That's exactly what development indicators do for countries. They're economic and social vitals that help geographers, policymakers, and international organizations understand where a country stands and what it might need. For the AP exam, you need to know not just what each measure means, but when to use which one, why they differ from each other, and critically, what each measure misses. Let's build this up carefully. GDP, the most famous number in economics, gross domestic product or GDP, measures the total monetary value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given year. The key phrase there is within borders. It doesn't matter who's doing the producing. If it happens on a country's soil, it counts. So if a Japanese-owned Toyota factory operates in Kentucky, that production counts toward the United States GDP, not Japan. Here's the formula you need to know. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M, where C is consumer spending, I is investment, G is government spending, and X minus M is net exports, exports minus imports. You won't need to calculate this from scratch on the AP exam, but you absolutely need to understand what the components represent and why a trade deficit, when imports exceed exports, reduces GDP. For the exam, the most important version of GDP you'll use is GDP per capita, which is simply total GDP divided by the country's population. This gives you a per-person average and allows fair comparisons between countries of wildly different sizes. China has a massive total GDP, but when you divide by 1.4 billion people, the per capita figure looks quite different than, say, Luxembourg's, which has a tiny population but extraordinary wealth concentrated among its residents. Think of it like dividing a pizza. A bigger pizza doesn't mean everyone gets more slices if there are way more people at the table. GNP and GNI, following the money, not the location. Now, here's where students start getting tripped up, so pay close attention. Gross National Product, or GNP, shifts the focus from location to ownership. GNP measures the total value of goods and services produced by a country's residents and businesses, regardless of where in the world that production takes place. Back to our Toyota example, if American citizens own businesses operating in Germany, that income counts toward the U.S. GNP, even though it happened on German soil. The formula relationship to remember is GNP equals GDP plus income earned by residents abroad, income earned by foreigners domestically. So GNP can be higher or lower than GDP depending on whether a country's citizens earn more abroad than foreigners earn within its borders. For a country like the Philippines, which has millions of overseas workers sending remittances home, GNP actually exceeds GDP. Those workers are Philippine residents earning income abroad, and that flows into the national GNP. Gross national income, or GNI, is essentially the modern replacement for GNP. The World Bank switched to using GNI because it's slightly more precise in how it accounts for international income flows. But for AP Human Geography purposes, you can treat GNP and GNI as functionally the same concept. If the exam uses GNI, think who owns it, not where it happens. HDI, the measure that looks beyond the wallet. Here's where development measurement gets genuinely interesting. All three of those previous measures are purely economic. They count money, but a country could have significant GDP per capita and still have citizens who can't read, die young, or lack access to education. That's why the United Nations Development Program created the Human Development Index, or HDI, in 1990. HDI is a composite index, meaning it combines multiple indicators into a single score, and it measures development along three dimensions: health, measured by life expectancy at birth; education, measured by mean years of schooling for adults and expected years of schooling for children; and standard of living, measured by GNI per capita, adjusted for purchasing power. Each dimension is scored and then combined into a final HDI score ranging from 0 to 1, with values closer to 1 representing higher human development. Countries are classified by HDI into 4 tiers: very high human development, roughly 0.8 and above; high, medium, and low human development. Norway and Switzerland consistently top the rankings. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa like Niger or Chad consistently rank near the bottom. For the FRQ, If you're asked to describe a country's development level, citing its HDI score, and what that means in terms of life expectancy and education access, will earn you scoring points that just citing GDP alone won't. The traps, the edge cases, and what to watch for. The single most common MCQ trap on this topic is confusing GDP with GNP or GNI. Always ask yourself, is this about where production happens, GDP, or who does the producing, GNP, GNI? A question about a multinational corporation's impact on a developing country is almost always testing this distinction. A second trap involves HDI versus GDP comparisons. Some countries rank higher on HDI than their GDP per capita would predict. Cuba is a classic example with strong life expectancy and literacy rates relative to its income level. Others rank lower on HDI than their GDP suggests, often oil-rich states where wealth is concentrated among few people and hasn't translated into broad social development. When you see this divergence on the exam, the correct explanation almost always involves income inequality or government investment in social services. You also need to know what all these measures fail to capture: informal economies, black markets, subsistence farming, income inequality within countries, environmental degradation, happiness or subjective well-being, and gender inequality. The Gini coefficient measures income inequality and is often paired with these measures in FRQ scenarios, asking you to give a more complete picture of development. Connections across the course. This topic is deeply connected to the rest of Unit 7. When you study Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth or Wallerstein's World Systems Theory, you'll use GDP and HDI to place countries within those frameworks. Core, periphery, and semi-periphery nations are partly distinguished by these very measures. In Unit 2, when you studied population pyramids and demographic transition, you were already looking at life expectancy, one of HDI's 3 pillars. When Unit 5 covered agricultural geography and subsistence farming, you were looking at exactly the kind of economic activity that GDP misses. Everything connects. With a solid understanding of how we measure development, and more importantly, why no single measure tells the whole story, you're perfectly set up to explore what actually drives development, and why some countries race ahead while others fall behind. 7.8 Gender Inequality Index, GII, and additional development indicators. What the GII actually measures. Let's talk about something the AP exam loves to test you on, and something that genuinely matters in the real world. You already know the Human Development Index, that composite measure of health, education, and income. But here's the thing. The HDI tells you how well a country is developing on average. The Gender Inequality Index asks a sharper question. How much of that development potential is being lost, specifically because of gender inequality? Think of it this way. Imagine 2 countries, both with identical HDI scores. In one country, men and women have roughly equal access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunity. In the other, men are thriving while women are being systematically excluded from political power in the workforce. The HDI can't distinguish between these 2 countries, but the GII can. That's its whole purpose, to reveal the hidden cost of gender inequality on human development. The GII is a composite index published by the United Nations Development Program as part of the same Human Development Reports family that gives us the HDI. It scores countries on a scale from 0 to 1, where 0 represents perfect equality, no losses due to gender inequality, and 1 represents maximum inequality. The higher the score, the worse the situation. This is one of your first potential MCQ traps. The GII is not like the HDI, where higher scores are better. For the GII, lower is better, because you want inequality to be as close to 0 as possible. The 3 dimensions and 5 indicators. The GII measures inequality across 3 dimensions using 5 specific indicators. You need to know all of them cold, because the AP exam will absolutely ask you to identify what the GII does and does not measure. The first dimension is reproductive health, and it uses 2 indicators, maternal mortality ratio and adolescent birth rate. Maternal mortality ratio measures the number of women who die per 100,000 live births due to pregnancy or childbirth complications. A high maternal mortality ratio signals that women lack access to quality health care during one of the most vulnerable moments of their lives. The adolescent birth rate measures the number of births per 1,000 women between ages 15 and 19. High adolescent birth rates often reflect limited access to education, contraception, and economic opportunity for young women. Girls who are becoming mothers are often girls who aren't finishing school. The second dimension is empowerment, measured by the share of seats held by women in national parliament, and the share of the adult population aged 25 and older, who have attained at least some secondary education, broken down by gender. The parliamentary seats indicator captures political voice. Can women participate in shaping the laws and policies that govern their lives? The education attainment indicator captures whether girls and boys are receiving comparable schooling, which is foundational to everything else. The third dimension is labor market participation, measured by female and male labor force participation rates. This tells you what share of working-age men versus women are actually engaged in paid work. A common exam trap here is confusing what the GII measures with what it doesn't. The GII does not directly measure wage gaps, legal rights, gender-based violence, or cultural attitudes. It's a useful snapshot, but it's not exhaustive. If an MCQ asks whether the GII captures women's representation in corporate leadership or tracks unpaid domestic labor, the answer is no. Those are not part of the index. How to read and interpret GII patterns. When you look at a world map shaded by GII scores, the geographic patterns align closely with what you know about development broadly. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and parts of the Middle East tend to have the highest GII scores, meaning the most inequality. The Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, consistently post some of the lowest GII scores in the world, near zero. This connects directly to what you know from Unit 7 about the relationship between development, education, and social equality. Here's a rich connection for your FRQ writing. High GII scores correlate strongly with high total fertility rates. Think about why. When women have low educational attainment, limited labor force participation, and little political power, they tend to have more children on average, not always by choice, but because of lack of access to family planning, economic dependence on male partners, and cultural structures that define women's value primarily through motherhood. This connects the GII to the demographic transition model from Unit 2. Countries in stages 1 and 2 of the DTM, with high birth rates and high death rates, are also the countries with the highest GII scores. As countries progress through the DTM towards stage 4 and stage 5, GII scores typically fall. Gender equality and demographic transition reinforce each other. Additional development indicators. Beyond the GII, the AP exam expects you to know several additional development metrics and what they each specifically capture. The Gender Development Index, or GDI, is the GII's close cousin and a common source of confusion. While the GII measures loss due to inequality, the GDI compares male and female HDI scores directly. It's essentially two separate HDI calculations, one for men and one for women, expressed as a ratio. A GDI of 1 means perfect parity. Below 1 means women's HDI is lower than men's, which is the case in most countries. The key distinction for your exam: GDI shows the gap in overall development between men and women, while the GII measures inequality specifically through reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market dimensions. You should also be comfortable discussing the Gini coefficient in this context, though it primarily measures income inequality within a country rather than gender inequality specifically. A Gini coefficient of 0 means perfect income equality. 1 means total inequality. The AP exam sometimes tests whether students can distinguish between Gini, GII, GDI, and HDI, so get those acronyms sorted clearly in your head. The most important FRQ connection. When you write about any of these indices on an FRQ, you need to demonstrate not just definitional knowledge, but analytical depth. The exam rewards you for explaining causal relationships. Don't just say country X has a high GII score. Explain what that means. Women in that country face limited access to healthcare, are underrepresented in political institutions, and participate less in the formal labor force. And this inequality represents lost human capital and suppressed economic development. That's the kind of sophisticated framing that earns full rubric credit. One more edge case to watch for. Some MCQs will give you a scenario where a country has a high HDI, but a moderate GII. This is entirely possible. Think of Gulf states like Qatar or UAE, which have high per capita incomes that boost HDI scores, but where women face significant restrictions in political participation and labor force engagement. The HDI doesn't capture that tension. The GII does. That's precisely why multiple indices exist, with a firm grasp of how gender inequality is measured and what it reveals about development. You're now perfectly positioned to explore how economic development models and global patterns of industrialization have shaped the uneven world you've been mapping all unit long. 7.9. The North-South Divide and Development Disparities. Setting the stage. A world divided. Imagine you're looking at a world map and someone draws a single curved line, not perfectly along a geographic latitude, but roughly through the middle of the globe, dipping south to include Australia and New Zealand on the wealthier side. That line, known as the Brandt Line, proposed by former West German Chancellor Willy Brandt in 1980, divides the world into what we call the global north and the global south, countries above the line. Think the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, tend to have higher GDPs, longer life expectancies, and stronger industrial bases. Countries below it, much of Latin America, Africa, and South Asia, tend to face persistent challenges in economic development, infrastructure, and human welfare. This is the north-south divide in one mental image, and it is the organizing idea for this entire section. Now the AP exam wants you to understand this not just as a map, but as a framework for analyzing development disparities, the measurable gaps in wealth, health, education, and opportunity that exist between and within countries. So let's build that framework together, layer by layer. Core concepts and terminology. The first thing to lock in is the vocabulary College Board uses. You will see terms like more developed countries, or MDCs, and less developed countries, or LDCs, sometimes also called newly industrialized countries, or NICs, for those nations in transition. The AP exam also uses the terms Global North and Global South, and it expects you to use them precisely. A critical trap on multiple choice questions is treating these as purely geographic categories. Australia and New Zealand are in the Southern Hemisphere, but are classified as Global North because of their development levels. If a question describes Australia and asks you to place it, do not let the word South fool you into putting it in the Global South. Development itself is measured in several ways, and you need to know all of them. Gross domestic product, or GDP, measures the total monetary value of goods and services produced within a country in a year. GDP per capita divides that by population, giving you a per-person average that is far more useful for comparing countries of different sizes. But here's where the exam gets tricky. GDP per capita tells you about average wealth, not about distribution. A country could have a high GDP per capita while most of its citizens live in poverty. If wealth is concentrated among a small elite, that is exactly why the Human Development Index, or HDI, matters so much. The Human Development Index, draw this, know this. The HDI is one of the most tested concepts in this unit, and the AP exam expects you to know not just what it is, but how it is structured. The HDI is a composite index developed by the United Nations that combines 3 dimensions: a long and healthy life, measured by life expectancy at birth, knowledge measured by mean years of schooling and expected years of schooling, and a decent standard of living, measured by gross national income per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP. Each dimension is scored on a scale from 0 to 1, and the 3 scores are averaged to produce an overall HDI score, also between 0 and 1. Countries closer to 1 are considered very high human development. Think Norway, which consistently ranks at or near the top. Countries closer to 0 face severe developmental challenges. Think many sub-Saharan African nations. On the FRQ, if you're asked to describe what HDI measures, you need to name all 3 dimensions explicitly. Partial credit is given for each component, so do not just say it measures development. That earns you nothing. Write out life expectancy, education, and income every time. The Gini coefficient, inequality within a country. Now let's talk about a concept that trips up a lot of students, the Gini coefficient. While HDI tells you about average development, the Gini coefficient measures income inequality within a country. It ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 means perfect equality. Everyone earns exactly the same. And 1 means perfect inequality. One person earns everything. Think of it this way. 2 countries could have identical GDPs per capita, and yet wildly different Gini scores. Brazil and Sweden might sit close on a GDP chart, but Sweden has one of the lowest Gini scores in the world, while Brazil has historically had one of the highest among major economies. The Gini coefficient is often visualized using a Lorenz curve, and you absolutely need to be able to describe and interpret this graph. On the axis, the x-axis represents the cumulative percentage of the population ranked from poorest to richest, and the y-axis represents the cumulative percentage of income earned. A perfectly equal society would follow the diagonal line of perfect equality, running straight from the bottom left to the top right corner. The actual Lorenz curve bows below that diagonal. The more it bows, the more it sags toward the bottom right, the greater the inequality, and the higher the Gini coefficient. The Gini is literally calculated as the area between the diagonal and the Lorenz curve, divided by the total area under the diagonal. You do not need to calculate it from scratch on the AP exam, but you do need to interpret which society is more unequal by looking at which curve sags more. Common misconceptions and MCQ traps. Here is a trap that appears regularly. Students confuse a country's level of development with its level of inequality. A country can be wealthy and highly unequal, like the United States, which has a relatively high Gini score for a developed nation, and a country can be poor but relatively equal, like certain Nordic countries were historically at earlier stages of industrialization. Development and equality are separate axes. Never conflate them. Another trap involves comparing HDI and GDP rankings. Sometimes a country ranks higher on HDI than on GDP per capita. Cuba is a classic example because it invests heavily in health and education, even without high incomes. The AP exam loves to ask why a country's HDI rank differs from its GDP rank, and the answer usually points to government investment in social services or, conversely, extreme inequality that distorts the income measure. Connections to other units. This topic connects deeply to Unit 2, where you studied population patterns. High HDI countries tend to be in stage 4 or 5 of the demographic transition model, with low birth rates and aging populations. Low HDI countries tend to cluster in stage 2 or 3, with high birth rates and younger populations. The North-South divide also echoes through Unit 5 in agricultural development. Subsistence farming is far more common in the global South, while commercial agriculture dominates the global North. And in Unit 6, you saw how this divide shapes urban structure. Informal settlements like favelas and slums are symptoms of rapid, under-resourced urbanization in LDCs. As you move into the next topic, you will start examining the specific theories and models like Wallerstein's world systems theory and Rostow's stages of economic growth that try to explain why this divide exists and whether it can be overcome. 7.10 Rostow's stages of economic growth model. The big picture, a map for economic development. Imagine you're watching a time lapse of a country's economy over 100 years. At first, almost everyone is farming. Then a few factories appear. Then cities explode with industry. Then, eventually, people are buying smartphones and taking vacations more than they're making steel. That transformation is exactly what W. Rostow was trying to capture when he published The Stages of Economic Growth in 1960. His model is one of the most important frameworks you'll encounter in AP Human Geography, and understanding it deeply, not just memorizing the names, is what separates a 3 from a 5 on exam day. Rostow was an American economist writing during the Cold War, and that context matters enormously. He was essentially arguing that every country could follow the same path to prosperity that Western nations had already traveled, a direct counter to communist development theory. The College Board loves asking questions that touch on this ideological dimension, so tuck it away. The 5 stages in plain English. Rostow's model describes 5 sequential stages that, in his view, all countries pass through on their way to becoming fully developed. Think of it like a video game with 5 levels that every player has to complete in order. Stage 1, traditional society. This is the starting point, a subsistence-based economy where most people are farmers, technology is minimal, and social structures are rigid and hierarchical. There's very little trade beyond the local level. Think of pre-colonial societies across Africa, Asia, and the Americas before European contact, or medieval Europe. The key geographic concept here is that primary sector activities, farming, fishing, logging, dominate completely. Stage 2, pre-pigzerts for takeoff. Here's where things start to shift. A society begins developing the infrastructure and institutions necessary for growth. Roads, ports, banking systems, and a commercial agriculture sector that produces for export rather than just local consumption. Critically, there's usually an external stimulus, often contact with a more developed nation, which is why colonialism fits uncomfortably into this stage. Britain during the late 1700s was transitioning here, and so was much of Latin America in the 19th century as export agriculture expanded. On the AP exam, watch for questions that ask you to identify characteristics of this stage. The answer often involves the emergence of an entrepreneurial class or the beginnings of infrastructure investment. Stage 3, takeoff. This is the dramatic pivot point of the entire model, the stage Rostow considered most important, and the one most frequently tested. Takeoff is characterized by rapid industrialization, the rise of manufacturing, and a surge in investment. Rostow even put rough percentages on it. Investment rises to around 10% of national income. 1 or 2 leading sectors drive explosive growth. Think textiles in Britain's Industrial Revolution, or steel in early 20th century America. Old social and political resistance to change is overcome. For a real-world anchor, think of South Korea in the 1960s and 70s as it transformed from an agricultural economy into an industrial powerhouse almost within a single generation. Stage 4. Drive to maturity. After takeoff, the economy diversifies. Growth spreads beyond those initial leading sectors into a wide range of industries. Technology improves, workers become more skilled, and the country becomes integrated into the global economy. The economy can now produce almost anything it chooses. Think of Germany or Japan in the post-war decades, churning out automobiles, chemicals, electronics, as they moved into this stage. Stage 5, age of high mass consumption. This is the finish line. The economy shifts toward the tertiary and quaternary sectors, services, finance, information, leisure. People have disposable income and spend it on consumer goods. The United States in the 1950s, with its suburban boom, car culture, and television sets in every living room, is Rostow's poster child for this stage. Today, most Western European nations, Japan, Australia, and the US are firmly here. Drawing the model for the FRQ. You absolutely need to be able to sketch Rostow's model. Picture a graph with time on the horizontal axis and economic development, or GDP per capita, on the vertical axis. The line starts nearly flat during stage 1, begins a slight upward tilt in stage 2, then rockets steeply upward during stage 3, the takeoff, before leveling into a steadier climb through stages 4 and 5. Label each stage clearly along the curve. The steepest inflection point, where the slope dramatically increases, is your takeoff. If an FRQ asks you to draw or annotate a development model, this is the diagram you reach for. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. Here's where students most often lose points. First, many students confuse Stage 2 and Stage 3. Remember, Stage 2 is about building the conditions for growth infrastructure institutions, while Stage 3 is the actual explosive growth itself. If a question describes a country building railroads and developing export agriculture, that's Stage 2. If it describes rapid factory construction and rising investment rates, that's Stage 3. Second, a very common trap is treating Rostow's model as universally accepted or beyond criticism. The AP exam frequently includes questions that ask you to identify a limitation or critique of the model. The two biggest critiques you must know are these. First, the model assumes a single linear path that all countries follow, ignoring that different countries have different histories, resources, and geographies. Second, it largely ignores the role of colonialism and dependency. The idea, articulated by dependency theorists like Andre Gunder Frank, that wealthy countries may have actually undermined the development of poorer nations rather than simply being ahead of them on the same road. Rostow's model is sometimes called a modernization theory, and you should know that term. Connections across the course. Rostow doesn't live in isolation on the exam. You'll need to connect it to other models and frameworks from across the course. In Unit 7, it pairs directly with Wallerstein's world systems theory, which offers a competing explanation of why some countries are wealthy, core nations, and others are not, periphery and semi-periphery. Where Rostow says every country can develop, Wallerstein says the system is designed to keep the periphery dependent. That tension is rich FRQ material. You'll also want to connect Rostow to the demographic transition model from Unit 2. Countries in the early stages of Rostow's model typically correspond to stages 1 and 2 of the demographic transition, with high birth and death rates. As countries move into Rostow's takeoff, they generally move into stage 3 of the demographic transition. Urbanization patterns from Unit 6 also connect here. Takeoff typically correlates with rapid urban growth as people leave farms for factory jobs. Finally, when you see questions about development indicators, GDP per capita, HDI, literacy rates, infant mortality, think about which Rostow stage a country's data might suggest. That translation skill is exactly what the exam tests. With Rostow's framework now in your toolkit, you're ready to explore the critiques and alternatives that challenge it, including the dependency theory and world systems theory that ask whether the development ladder is actually available to everyone or whether it was pulled up long ago. 7.1 Wallerstein's world systems theory, core, periphery, semi-periphery. The big idea, the world as one giant economy. Imagine the global economy as a high school cafeteria. There's a table in the center where the popular wealthy kids sit. They set the trends, control the best resources, and benefit the most from the whole social system. Then there's the table near the edge of the room where kids have fewer options, do a lot of the heavy lifting, and receive a smaller share of the reward. And somewhere in the middle, there's a table of kids trying hard to move up, maybe even helping enforce the rules of the popular table while secretly dreaming of joining it. That, in essence, is Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory, and it is one of the most important frameworks you will encounter on your AP Human Geography exam. Wallerstein, a sociologist and historical economist, developed this theory in the 1970s. His central argument is this: the world economy functions as a single interconnected capitalist system, and countries occupy different positions within that system based on their economic power, technological capacity, and political influence. This is not a theory about individual countries developing in isolation. It is explicitly about relationships between countries and how those relationships create and sustain inequality. That relational quality is what makes it so useful and so testable. Core, periphery, and semi-periphery, defining the three zones. The core consists of wealthy, powerful, highly industrialized nations that dominate global trade, finance, and technology. Think of the United States, Western European nations like Germany and France, Japan and Australia. Core countries have strong governments, diversified economies, high-wage labor, and tend to export high-value manufactured goods, financial services, and intellectual property. They consume raw materials and cheap goods produced elsewhere, and they benefit disproportionately from the global economic system. The periphery sits at the opposite end. Peripheral nations are characterized by low wages, less developed infrastructure, dependence on exporting raw materials or very low-value goods, and limited political power in global institutions. Much of sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Central America, and several nations in Southeast Asia have historically occupied peripheral positions. The key word here is dependence. Peripheral countries are structurally dependent on core countries for investment, technology, and markets. That dependence is not accidental. Wallerstein argues it is built into the architecture of the world system itself. And then there is the semi-periphery, and this is where students most often get confused, so pay close attention. The semi-periphery is not just countries in the middle. Semi-peripheral nations play a dual role. They are exploited by core countries above them while simultaneously exploiting peripheral countries below them. Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa are classic examples of semi-peripheral nations. They have significant manufacturing capacity, growing middle classes, and rising political influence. But they still face structural disadvantages relative to the core: lower wages than core nations, technological dependence, and vulnerability to global financial shocks. China is a particularly nuanced example because its sheer economic scale blurs the line, which is exactly the kind of edge case the AP exam loves to test. The model: how to draw and interpret the diagram. For the AP exam, you need to be able to describe and interpret the world systems model visually. Picture 3 concentric circles or rings. The innermost circle is the core. The middle ring is the semi-periphery. The outer ring is the periphery. Arrows in this diagram should flow in two directions. Resources and cheap labor flow inward from periphery to core, while capital, technology, and finished goods flow outward from core to periphery. The semi-periphery has bidirectional arrows. It receives some capital and technology from the core while extracting resources from the periphery. This flow of resources and wealth from the outside inward is the engine of global inequality in Wallerstein's framework. If an FRQ asks you to describe relationships between zones, use those directional flows explicitly. Key exam traps and how to avoid them. Here is where many students drop points. The first trap is confusing world systems theory with Rostow's stages of economic growth. Rostow sees development as a linear ladder. Every country can climb from traditional society to high mass consumption if it follows the right steps. Wallerstein fundamentally rejects this. For Wallerstein, the global system is designed to keep peripheral nations peripheral, because core nations benefit from that arrangement. Development is not a ladder, it is a hierarchy maintained by power. When the AP exam asks you to contrast these two models, that distinction is the heart of the answer. The second trap is assuming that semi-peripheral status is a permanent stepping stone to the core. Wallerstein does not say that. Movement between zones is possible, but rare and contested. Some nations do move up, like South Korea transitioning from semi-peripheral to near-core status over the late 20th century. But the system actively resists upward mobility because core nations use multinational corporations, trade agreements, and international financial institutions like the IMF to maintain their advantage. That structural resistance is key. The third trap involves conflating the periphery with developing countries as a monolithic category. Not every developing country is in the same position. An AP multiple-choice question might describe a country exporting manufactured goods to a less developed neighbor, while importing technology from Europe, That description points to semi-peripheral status, not peripheral, even if the country has a relatively low GDP. Connections to other units. World systems theory does not live in isolation on the exam. It threads through the entire course. In Unit 2, when you study population and migration, remember that labor migration from periphery to core is a world systems phenomenon. Workers move toward capital, just as Wallerstein would predict. In Unit 5, when you examine agricultural patterns, the concept of commodity dependence, where peripheral nations rely on exporting a single crop or resource, directly reflects peripheral positioning in the world system. In Unit 6, discussions of urban primacy and informal economies in peripheral cities connect to the uneven development that world systems theory explains. Even dependency theory, which you may encounter as a related concept, is essentially the intellectual precursor to Wallerstein's framework. Both argue that global trade structures perpetuate underdevelopment rather than solve it. When you see an FRQ asking you to explain why economic development is uneven across regions, or why globalization has not lifted all countries equally, Wallerstein's framework gives you the conceptual vocabulary to answer with precision. Use the terms core, periphery, and semi-periphery. Describe the directional flows of capital and resources. Contrast it with Rostow if asked to compare theories, and always emphasize that in Wallerstein's view, the system is the explanation. Inequality is not a failure of development, it is a feature of the world system itself. With that structural understanding of how the global economy creates and sustains inequality, you are perfectly positioned to explore the specific forces, technological change, industrialization, and global trade patterns that have physically reshaped where and how production happens across the world. 7.12 Dependency Theory, a Neocolonialism. Setting the stage, a tale of two countries. Imagine you're playing a board game where the rules were written by the players who got to start first, and they wrote those rules to make sure they'd keep winning. That's essentially the critique at the heart of dependency theory, and understanding it deeply is your ticket to a strong score on the AP exam. Dependency theory emerged in the 1960s and 70s, largely from Latin American economists and sociologists who were frustrated with one simple observation. Despite decades of trade and interaction with wealthy nations, many developing countries seem to be getting relatively worse off, not better. The theory argues that the poverty and underdevelopment of poorer nations isn't accidental or simply a matter of being behind on some universal ladder of progress. Instead, dependency theorists argue that the global economic system is deliberately structured to keep wealthy core nations wealthy at the expense of poor periphery nations. The relationship isn't neutral partnership, it's extraction. The core periphery framework. You've already encountered Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory back in Unit 7, and dependency theory is its ideological cousin. Both frameworks divide the world into core, periphery, and semi-periphery nations. Core nations, think the United States, Germany, Japan, control capital, technology, and high-value manufacturing. Periphery nations supply raw materials and cheap labor. Semi-periphery nations like Brazil, Mexico, or South Korea sit in between, doing some manufacturing but still dependent on core nations for technology and investment. Here's the key distinction the AP exam loves to test. World systems theory is primarily a descriptive model of how the global economy is organized. Dependency theory is primarily an explanatory and critical theory that asks why periphery nations stay periphery nations. Don't mix these up on the MCQ. World systems theory maps the structure. Dependency theory interrogates who benefits from that structure and how it's maintained. How dependency actually works. Think of it this way. Imagine a country in sub-Saharan Africa that exports raw copper ore to Germany, where it's processed into electronic components, which are then sold back to African consumers at enormous markup. The African nation earns a little from the raw commodity export, but pays a lot for the finished product. This is called unequal exchange, a foundational concept in dependency theory. Periphery nations export low-value primary goods and import high-value manufactured goods, so wealth continuously flows out of the periphery and into the core. The terms of trade are structurally unfavorable to developing nations, and this isn't a coincidence according to dependency theorists. It's the architecture of the global system. This also connects directly to the commodity dependence trap you need to recognize. Many periphery nations rely on exporting just one or two primary commodities, coffee, oil, copper, cacao. When global commodity prices drop, which they frequently do, these nations' entire economies collapse. Core nations, meanwhile, have diversified, high-value, resilient economies. The AP exam will often present a scenario where a developing nation is heavily dependent on a single export commodity and ask you to evaluate its development prospects. Dependency theory would predict continued vulnerability and underdevelopment. Neocolonialism, the empire strikes back, quietly. Here's where things get really interesting and where students frequently lose points by conflating two distinct ideas. Neocolonialism refers to the ways in which wealthy nations and multinational corporations maintain economic and political control over formerly colonized nations, after formal political independence has been granted. The flags changed, the governors left, but the economic relationships, many argue, remained fundamentally intact. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana, coined the term in 1965. He argued that even though African nations had won political sovereignty, they remained economically subordinate to former colonial powers through trade agreements, debt, foreign investment, and control of financial institutions. The mechanism had shifted from direct political rule to indirect economic influence, but the outcome, continued extraction of wealth, looked disturbingly similar. Concretely, neocolonialism manifests through several channels you should be able to name for the FRQ. First, multinational corporations, MNCs, invest in periphery nations, but repatriate profits back to core nations, meaning the economic gains don't circulate in the local economy. Second, structural adjustment programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank, which are controlled by wealthy nations, require developing countries to privatize industries, cut social spending, and open markets as conditions for loans. Critics argue these policies serve core nation economic interests more than local development. Third, trade agreements often lock developing nations into arrangements that favor manufactured exports from wealthy nations while limiting protections for developing economies' infant industries. The AP exam traps to watch for. The most common MCQ trap is treating neocolonialism and colonialism as synonymous. They are not. Colonialism involves direct political control and formal territorial occupation. Neocolonialism involves indirect economic and political influence after formal independence. If a question describes a nation that is politically sovereign but economically dominated by foreign corporations and international financial institutions, the correct term is neocolonialism, not colonialism. A second trap involves confusing dependency theory with modernization theory, which you studied earlier in Unit 7. Modernization theory, associated with W. Rostow's stages of economic growth, argues that all nations follow a universal path to development, and that poorer nations just need capital investment, technology transfer, and time. Dependency theorists directly refute this, arguing that integration into the global economy causes underdevelopment rather than curing it. If an AP question asks, which theory suggests that foreign investment harms rather than helps developing nations, the answer is dependency theory, not modernization theory. These are opposing frameworks. Connecting to the bigger picture, dependency theory and neocolonialism connect to several other AP human geography themes you've studied. Think back to Unit 6 and the discussion of urban primacy and informal economies. Dependency theorists would argue that the bloated primate cities of the developing world and the massive informal sector are consequences of dependency relationships, not simply quirks of local culture. In Unit 7 itself, this topic links directly to debates about foreign direct investment, export processing zones, and international trade patterns. When you see a question about why a developing nation's economy seems to grow statistically, but inequality worsens and profits leave the country, dependency theory is the analytical lens the College Board wants you to apply. For the FRQ, if you're asked to explain why the economic gap between core and periphery persists, you need to name specific mechanisms: unequal exchange, commodity dependence, neocolonial debt structures, MNC profit repatriation, not just say rich countries are stronger. Specificity is what earns rubric points. As you move forward, you'll see how these power dynamics between wealthy and developing nations shape patterns of migration, urbanization, and environmental change across the globe. And those connections will keep coming up right through the end of the course. 7.13 Commodity Dependence and the Resource Curse. The paradox that trips everyone up. Here's a riddle that will stick with you. Why do some of the world's most resource-rich countries have some of the world's most impoverished populations? Nigeria sits atop enormous oil reserves. The Democratic Republic of Congo holds roughly half the world's cobalt. Venezuela has more proven oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, and yet in each of these countries, the majority of citizens struggle with poverty, weak institutions, and economic instability. This puzzle is exactly what AP Human Geography calls the resource curse, and it's one of the most counterintuitive, exam-heavy concepts in Unit 7. Let's build this from the ground up. Commodity dependence, the foundation. Commodity dependence occurs when a country relies on a small number of primary commodities, raw materials like oil, minerals, agricultural products, or timber, for the majority of its export earnings, typically more than 60% of total export revenue. Think of a country as a small business. If that business sells only one product and that product's price collapses overnight, the whole operation is in trouble. That's exactly the vulnerability commodity-dependent economies face. The College Board distinguishes between types of commodities because this distinction matters for the exam. Primary commodities are unprocessed or minimally processed raw materials extracted directly from the environment: crude oil, raw cotton, copper ore, cocoa beans. These sit at the very bottom of the commodity chain. Countries that export primarily at this stage capture very little of the total value created as the commodity moves through processing, manufacturing, and retail. This connects directly to the concept of value added in production, a recurring AP theme. A country exporting cocoa beans earns a fraction of what a country manufacturing and selling chocolate earns from the same raw material. The resource curse explained. The resource curse, also called the paradox of plenty, is the phenomenon by which countries with abundant natural resources tend to experience slower economic growth, weaker democratic institutions, and greater conflict compared to countries with fewer natural resources. Notice the College Board language here. It's not that resources are inherently bad, it's that the economic and political dynamics they generate tend to produce these negative outcomes. That nuance matters on the FRQ. So how does a gift become a curse? Walk through the mechanism with me. When a country discovers a lucrative resource, say oil, foreign investment floods in, the currency appreciates significantly, and suddenly the export sector looks extremely profitable. But here's the trap. That currency appreciation makes every other export more expensive on the world market. Your farmers, textile manufacturers, and technology firms suddenly can't compete internationally because your currency is too strong. This phenomenon has its own name, Dutch disease, and it is absolutely essential AP vocabulary. Dutch disease gets its name from the Netherlands in the 1960s, when the discovery of natural gas caused the Dutch guilder to appreciate so sharply that Dutch manufacturing became uncompetitive and began to collapse. The same pattern is played out from Nigeria to Bolivia to Zambia. You strengthen one sector so dramatically that you hollow out all the others on the exam. If you see a question about a country where resource wealth correlates with declining manufacturing or agricultural exports, Dutch disease is almost certainly the answer being tested. Political and institutional dimensions. Now here's where the resource curse goes deeper than economics. When governments can fund themselves through resource extraction rather than taxation, they become less accountable to their citizens. In a normal political economy, governments need to tax their population, and taxpayers demand representation and accountability in return. That's the political foundation behind the phrase, no taxation without representation. But in a resource-dependent state, the government can distribute oil revenues as patronage, fund security forces, and maintain power without ever needing citizen buy-in. Scholars call these rentier states governments that derive their income primarily from rents on natural resources rather than from productive economic activity or taxation. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and historically Libya are classic examples. The AP exam also connects the resource curse to political instability and conflict. When a single resource generates enormous wealth, controlling the government means controlling that wealth. This raises the stakes of political competition to the point where armed conflict becomes rational for rival groups. The concept of resource wars, conflicts driven primarily by competition over valuable natural resources, ties directly here. Think about conflict diamonds in Sierra Leone, oil-driven civil war in Nigeria's Niger Delta, or coltan mining fueling conflict in the DRC. These aren't just history lessons. They're the exam's evidence base for why the resource curse involves more than just economics. How to draw and interpret the key diagram. For the exam, you should be prepared to sketch a simple diagram illustrating the commodity dependence cycle. Draw a circular flow. Resource extraction generates export revenue, which flows to government, which becomes dependent on commodity prices, which fluctuate on global markets the country cannot control, which then creates boom-bust cycles in government spending and economic stability. Label the arrows showing where Dutch disease enters. currency appreciation crowding out other exports, and where the rentier-state dynamic enters, resource revenue replacing tax revenue and reducing accountability. If an FRQ asks you to explain why a country struggles to diversify its economy, walking through this diagram conceptually will earn you multiple scoring points. Edge cases and common MCQ traps. Here are the traps the exam loves to set. First, don't confuse commodity dependence with being a poor country. Qatar and Kuwait are extremely wealthy and commodity dependent. The curse shows up in their lack of economic diversification and institutional accountability, not necessarily in income statistics. Second, don't assume all resource-rich countries suffer the resource curse equally. Botswana, for example, is frequently cited as a country that managed diamond wealth relatively well through strong institutions and deliberate diversification policy. It's the exception that proves the rule, and the AP exam occasionally uses Botswana as a contrast case. Third, watch for questions that conflate the resource curse with colonialism. They overlap and reinforce each other, but they are distinct concepts with distinct mechanisms. Connections to other units. This topic is a hub that connects to half the course. From Unit 5, agricultural commodity dependence connects to export-oriented agriculture and the structural vulnerability of subsistence versus cash crop economies. From Unit 7 itself, the commodity chain concept and Wallerstein's world systems theory tie in directly. Commodity-dependent countries almost always occupy peripheral status, exporting raw materials to core countries that capture the value-added stages. From Unit 4, the political geography of resource conflict and state fragility connects to centrifugal forces that can fragment nations. When you write an FRQ on development, weaving in the resource curse as a barrier to structural transformation will consistently earn you top-tier analysis points. The resource curse ultimately teaches us that wealth in the ground doesn't automatically become wealth in people's lives, and understanding why that gap exists is precisely what moves us into our next topic, the strategies developing countries use to actually bridge it. 7.14 Comparative Advantage and Global Trade Patterns. The core idea: why countries specialize. Imagine you and your roommate are getting ready for a dinner party. You're a fantastic cook, but also the fastest person alive at grocery shopping. Your roommate is a decent cook, but absolutely terrible at grocery shopping. They take 3 times as long as you. Should you do both tasks yourself? Not necessarily. Even though you're better at both, the smartest move might be for you to cook while your roommate shops, because that division of labor gets everything done faster. That intuition is the heart of comparative advantage, and it's one of the most powerful ideas in all of economics and human geography. Comparative advantage is the ability of a country or region or person to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. Notice that phrase carefully: opportunity cost, not absolute efficiency. This is where students consistently trip up on the AP exam. Absolute advantage means you can produce more of something with the same resources. Comparative advantage means you give up less to produce it. These are completely different concepts, and the College Board loves to test whether you can tell them apart. A country can have an absolute advantage in producing everything and still benefit from trade based on comparative advantage. The opportunity cost calculation. Here's the formula you need to internalize. Opportunity cost of producing good A equals the units of good B you must give up to produce 1 unit of good A. Let's make this concrete. Suppose country alpha can produce either 100 units of wheat or 50 units of steel with the same resources. Country beta can produce either 60 units of wheat or 60 units of steel. To find comparative advantage, calculate opportunity cost for each good in each country. In alpha, 1 unit of wheat costs 0.5 units of steel because 50 divided by 100 equals 0.5. 1 unit of steel costs 2 units of wheat because 100 divided by 50 equals 2. In beta, 1 unit of wheat costs 1 unit of steel because 60 divided by 60 equals 1. 1 unit of steel costs 1 unit of wheat. Alpha has comparative advantage in wheat because it gives up only 0.5 steel per wheat, while beta gives up 1 steel per wheat. Beta has comparative advantage in steel because it gives up only 1 wheat per steel, while alpha gives up 2. Each country specializes in the good where its opportunity cost is lower, and then they trade. Both countries end up with more of both goods than they could produce alone. This is the theoretical engine behind global trade patterns. How this shapes the world map of production. Now scale that logic up to actual countries, and you start to see why the world looks the way it does. Countries in the global south with large pools of low-wage labor and favorable climates specialize in labor-intensive agriculture and light manufacturing. Countries like Bangladesh dominate global garment production, not because they have the world's most advanced textile machinery, but because their comparative advantage, low labor costs, makes the opportunity cost of producing clothing extremely low. Meanwhile, Germany and Japan concentrate on high-precision engineering and automotive production, where their skilled labor force and technological capital give them a comparative advantage there. This connects directly to world systems theory from earlier in Unit 7. Core countries tend to have comparative advantages in capital-intensive high-technology goods. Periphery and semi-periphery countries tend to hold comparative advantages in raw materials, agricultural commodities, and low-skilled manufacturing. That pattern isn't random. It was shaped by colonialism, investment flows, infrastructure, and education systems built up over centuries. The production possibilities frontier. The AP exam expects you to draw, read, and interpret a production possibilities frontier, or PPF. Picture a graph with two axes. Good A on the horizontal axis and good B on the vertical axis. The PPF is a downward sloping line. For our purposes, assume it's a straight line, which indicates constant opportunity costs, connecting the maximum possible production points. Any point on the line represents full resource use. Points inside the line represent inefficiency. Points outside the line are unattainable without trade. Here's where it gets interesting. Trade allows a country to consume at a point outside its own PPF. That's the whole payoff of specialization and exchange. When you see a PPF question on the AP exam, you're often being asked to identify which country has the flatter or steeper slope for a given good, and that slope directly tells you the opportunity cost. A country with a flatter PPF for good, a less vertical drop per unit of A, has a lower opportunity cost and thus a comparative advantage in producing A. Trade barriers and their geographic effects. Of course, the real world isn't a clean theory problem. Trade barriers, tariffs, quotas, embargoes, and subsidies distort comparative advantage. A tariff is a tax on imports that raises the price of foreign goods, making domestic producers more competitive even when they lack comparative advantage. A quota sets a hard limit on how many units of a foreign good can enter. Subsidies give domestic producers an artificial cost advantage. The College Board wants you to understand not just what these tools are, but their geographic consequences. They can shift where production occurs globally, protect infant industries in developing nations, or entrench inefficiencies in wealthy countries protecting politically powerful industries. Think agricultural subsidies in the European Union or the United States. Trade blocs and regional integration. Comparative advantage also operates at the scale of trade blocs. The European Union's single market, NAFTA, now replaced by the USMCA, ASEAN. These agreements reduce trade barriers among member nations, allowing comparative advantages within the bloc to drive specialization. When you hear questions about why Mexico produces so much automotive content for American vehicles, you're looking at comparative advantage operating within a trade agreement framework, combined with proximity and maquiladora zones near the U.S. border. Common MCQ traps to avoid. The single most common trap is confusing absolute advantage with comparative advantage. A country can be worse at producing everything in absolute terms and still have a comparative advantage in something. In fact, by definition, every country has a comparative advantage in at least one good. Another trap, students assume that lower wages always equal comparative advantage in manufacturing. But if those workers are less productive, the cost advantage can disappear. Always calculate opportunity cost, don't assume. A third trap involves trade deficits, which the exam sometimes frames negatively. A trade deficit isn't automatically harmful. It may simply reflect comparative advantage at work, with a country importing what others produce most efficiently. Connections across the course. This topic weaves through much of the course. In Unit 5, you saw how agricultural patterns reflect specialization in food production. In Unit 6, industrial location models like Weber's least cost theory describe how firms seek comparative advantages in production costs. Wallerstein's world systems theory in Unit 7 explains how comparative advantage patterns were historically constructed and maintained. And in Unit 2, migration patterns often follow economic opportunity created when comparative advantage draws investment and jobs to particular regions. With a solid grip on comparative advantage, you're well positioned to understand how development economists and geographers evaluate why some countries grow wealthy while others remain trapped in the export of low-value commodities, which is exactly what we'll explore as we turn to development indicators and measures of economic growth. 7.15 Globalization and the International Division of Labor. Let's talk about something you interact with every single day without probably realizing it. Right now, the device you're using to listen to this was almost certainly designed in one country, had its components manufactured in several others, was assembled somewhere else entirely, and was marketed to you by a company whose headquarters might be on a completely different continent. That whole web of decisions, who does what work, where and why, is the international division of labor, and understanding it is absolutely essential for scoring a 5 on your AP Human Geography exam. The core idea, who does what, and why. The international division of labor refers to the way different countries specialize in particular stages of production, based on their comparative advantages. And when the College Board uses that phrase, comparative advantage, they mean it very specifically. A country has a comparative advantage when it can produce something at a lower opportunity cost than another country, even if it isn't the most efficient producer in absolute terms. That distinction matters on multiple choice questions. Don't confuse comparative advantage with absolute advantage, which just means being the best at producing something outright. Here's a classic analogy. Imagine a brilliant surgeon who also happens to type faster than anyone in her office. Should she do her own typing? Absolutely not. Her time treating patients is far too valuable. Her opportunity cost of typing is enormous. So she hires an assistant, and both people end up better off. Countries work the same way. Bangladesh may not be the most productive textile manufacturer in the world in absolute terms, but the opportunity cost of producing garments there is so low given its labor costs and economic structure that it holds a massive comparative advantage in that industry. Globalization as the engine. Globalization is what made the international division of labor so complex and far-reaching. As trade barriers fell, transportation costs dropped, especially container shipping, which revolutionized global trade in the mid-20th century, and communication technology improved. Companies found it not just possible, but profitable to scatter their production across the globe. This process is sometimes called the new international division of labor, a term you should know cold. It emerged in the 1970s and 1980s as manufacturing began shifting from wealthy core countries to lower-wage periphery and semi-periphery countries, terminology borrowed directly from world systems theory, which you studied earlier in this unit. Think of the old division of labor as a simple two-act play. Core countries manufactured goods, periphery countries supplied raw materials. The new division is more like a sprawling ensemble drama. A semiconductor might be designed in Silicon Valley, etched in Taiwan, incorporated into a circuit board in Malaysia, installed in a device assembled in China, and sold by a company legally headquartered in Ireland for tax purposes. Every single step in that chain represents a deliberate labor decision based on cost, skill availability, and access to infrastructure. Key concepts the exam will test. You need to be comfortable with several interconnected ideas here. First, commodity chains, also called global commodity chains or global value chains, describe the entire sequence of activities involved in producing and delivering a good or service. The College Board loves asking you to trace a commodity chain and identify where value is being added at each stage. High-value activities like research, design, branding, and finance tend to cluster in core countries. Low-value, labor-intensive activities like assembly and basic manufacturing tend to locate in periphery or semi-periphery countries. This pattern is sometimes visualized as a smile curve, and you should be able to sketch it for the exam. Draw a U-shaped curve like a smile with the stages of production along the horizontal axis, from pre-production on the left, R&D design, raw materials, through manufacturing in the middle, to post-production on the right, marketing, distribution, retail, after-sales service. Value added goes on the vertical axis. The curve dips in the middle and rises on both ends, meaning that manufacturing itself, the part most often located in developing countries, captures the least value. The highest profits go to the companies controlling the endpoints, the designers and the brand managers. This diagram is an exceptionally common FRQ and MCQ target, so practice drawing and labeling it until it's automatic. Common exam traps to avoid. One of the most frequent wrong answer traps is assuming that cheap labor is the only factor driving the international division of labor. The exam will present scenarios where cheap labor is present, but other location factors, poor infrastructure, political instability, lack of skilled workers, distance from markets, make a location less attractive. Always think holistically. A related trap involves outsourcing versus offshoring. Outsourcing means contracting work to an external company, which could be domestic or foreign. Offshoring means relocating production to another country, which might involve your own company's facilities. A firm can outsource domestically, offshore without outsourcing, or do both simultaneously. The College Board has tested this distinction directly. Another edge case worth flagging: reshoring and nearshoring are increasingly relevant concepts. Reshoring means bringing production back to the home country, often because rising wages abroad, automation, or supply chain disruption, think COVID-19 in 2020, have changed the calculus. Nearshoring means relocating to a nearby country. U.S. companies moving manufacturing to Mexico instead of China is the classic example. If the exam gives you a scenario about a company bringing jobs back to the United States or shifting from China to Vietnam, those are examples of these newer dynamics within the international division of labor. Connections across the course. This topic connects almost everywhere. From Unit 2, you'll recall how demographic factors like population age and workforce size influence labor costs. Countries in Stage 2 or early Stage 3 of the demographic transition often have large young labor forces that attract manufacturing investment. From Unit 6, you know that special economic zones and export processing zones are geographic tools that governments use specifically to attract foreign firms by offering tax incentives and relaxed regulations. And from earlier in Unit 7, Wallerstein's world systems theory provides the theoretical framework that explains why core, semi-periphery, and periphery countries play such different roles in global commodity chains. For the FRQ, scoring rubric points almost always require you to connect a specific example to a specific geographic concept. Don't just say cheap labor in China. Say China's comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing, combined with export processing zones that reduce barriers for multinational firms, positioned it as a key node in global commodity chains during the late 20th century. That's the difference between a one-point answer and a full credit answer. As you move into the final stretch of Unit 7, you'll see how these production patterns connect directly to questions of economic development, inequality between nations, and the efforts some countries make to climb from the periphery toward the core, which is exactly what we'll dig into next. 7.16 Outsourcing, Offshoring, and Global Commodity Chains. The big picture: your shirt has lived more places than you have? Let's start with something concrete: the t-shirt you're probably wearing right now. The cotton was likely grown in India or the American South, spun into fabric in Bangladesh or Vietnam, assembled in Cambodia or Ethiopia, shipped through a port in Rotterdam or Los Angeles, branded in a corporate headquarters in New York, and sold to you at a mall in Ohio. That single shirt crossed 8 time zones and touched 6 countries before it landed on your back. That journey, that global choreography of production, is exactly what this section is about. The College Board wants you to understand how and why production has become fragmented across the globe, and what the human and geographic consequences of that fragmentation look like. So let's build this carefully, because the exam will test both the vocabulary and the deeper reasoning. Outsourcing versus offshoring, the trap that gets everyone. This is the #1 vocabulary trap on the AP exam, and students lose points on it constantly, so pay close attention. Outsourcing means hiring an outside company or contractor to perform a task that was previously done in-house. Crucially, outsourcing does not require crossing a national border. An American car company that contracts its payroll processing to an accounting firm in Chicago has outsourced that function. Fully domestic, no border crossing involved. Offshoring, by contrast, specifically means relocating a business process or production function to another country. The key distinction the exam wants you to internalize is that offshoring is always international, while outsourcing may or may not be. Now here's where it gets nuanced, and where the tricky MCQ options appear. A company can offshore without outsourcing. Imagine Nike opens its own factory in Vietnam. That factory is wholly owned and operated by Nike. That is offshoring, but it is not outsourcing because Nike hasn't hired an outside party. Conversely, a company can outsource without offshoring, like that Chicago accounting example. And of course, a company can do both simultaneously, which is called offshore outsourcing, hiring a foreign third-party company to perform a function. Most of what you read about in the news, like American tech companies contracting customer service centers in India, is offshore outsourcing. When the exam gives you an answer choice that conflates these terms, pause and ask yourself, does this cross a border? Does this involve a third party? Your answer changes based on those 2 questions. Why it happens. The logic of global production. Companies offshore and outsource for reasons that Weber's least cost theory helps explain, and this is your connection back to Unit 7's earlier material. Firms seek to minimize production costs, and the biggest lever in labor-intensive industries is wages. When a software company moves data entry to the Philippines, or a garment company moves cutting and sewing to Cambodia, they are chasing lower labor costs while still selling into high-income markets. This wage differential, the gap between what workers are paid in core countries versus peripheral and semi-peripheral countries, is the engine driving the whole system. But cost isn't the only driver. Companies also offshore to access raw materials closer to their source, to avoid environmental or labor regulations in their home country, to benefit from tax incentives offered by host governments, and to get inside trade blocs. A Japanese automaker building a plant in Alabama isn't just chasing cheap wages, they're leaping over American tariffs on imported vehicles by producing domestically. That's a regulatory arbitrage play, and it shows up on FRQs when the exam asks you to explain why a firm chose a particular location. Global commodity chains, the map of modern production. A global commodity chain, sometimes called a global value chain, is the full sequence of activities involved in bringing a product from raw material extraction through production, distribution, and final sale to the consumer. Think of it as a flowchart of a product's life. The AP exam will sometimes present you with a diagram of this chain, and you need to be able to read it, label it, and explain what each stage reveals about economic geography. Picture a simple vertical diagram with raw material extraction at the bottom, manufacturing in the middle, and retail and marketing at the top. Geographers describe this shape as a smile curve when you graph value added against the production stages, and that image is worth locking into your memory. The stage is closest to the consumer, research, design, branding, retail, and the stages at the very beginning, raw material ownership, capture the most profit. The manufacturing stage in the middle, which is most easily offshored, actually captures the least value per unit. This is why Bangladesh earns only a few dollars for sewing a shirt that retails for $50. The smile dips in the middle and rises at both ends, concentrating wealth in the core countries that control design and distribution, while the labor-intensive middle gets pushed to the periphery. This connects directly to Wallerstein's world systems theory, core, semi-periphery, periphery, which you studied earlier in the unit. Consequences and the human geography layer. The exam will absolutely ask you about the consequences of these processes, so think through both sides. For receiving countries, the offshore destinations, you often see job creation, technology transfer, infrastructure investment, and export earnings that can fund development. For sending countries, you may see job losses in manufacturing sectors, particularly affecting working-class communities. The Rust Belt in the American Midwest is the canonical example here. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh that once dominated steel and auto production saw devastating deindustrialization as production relocated. Meanwhile, the maquiladora zones along the U.S.-Mexico border are the flip side, export processing zones specifically designed to attract offshore manufacturing by offering tax breaks, low wages, and relaxed regulations. Special economic zones and export processing zones deserve a direct call-out because they appear on MCQs as examples of how governments deliberately attract FDI and offshore production. Know that these zones are geographically bounded areas with distinct regulatory environments designed to reduce the friction of offshoring. FRQ, scoring points to lock in. When you write about this topic on a free response question, the College Board rewards precise language and specific examples. Use the term global commodity chain or global value chain, not just supply chain. Name a specific real-world example, the smartphone industry, fast fashion, coffee, and trace at least 2 stages geographically. Explain the economic logic, wage differentials, regulatory incentives, market access, not just the pattern. And if the question asks about consequences, address both the sending and receiving country, because rubrics almost always split points between both sides of the equation. The distinction between outsourcing and offshoring is so commonly tested that you should treat it as a guaranteed point of differentiation on any question touching this topic. If you can nail that distinction cold, explain the smile curve, connect it to world systems theory, and give a concrete example from the real world. You are writing a 5-worthy response. As we move forward into the final pieces of Unit 7, we'll look at how development indicators measure which countries actually benefit from all this global economic activity, and why the gains from integration into the global economy are distributed so unevenly across the world. 7.17 multiplier effect, and its role in regional economic growth. The snowball that starts an avalanche. Imagine you drop a single snowball at the top of a hill. It rolls, picks up more snow, gets bigger, rolls faster, picks up even more snow, and by the time it reaches the bottom, you've got an avalanche from a single small push. That, in essence, is the multiplier effect. One economic action, one factory opening, one new hospital, one government contract, doesn't just create the jobs it directly produces. It sets off a chain reaction that ripples through the entire regional economy, generating far more economic activity than that original investment ever could on its own. This concept is one of the most important ideas in Unit 7, and the AP exam tests it in some genuinely tricky ways, so let's make sure you understand it from the ground up. The core definition and how it works. The multiplier effect, as College Board defines it, describes how an initial investment or economic activity in a region generates additional rounds of economic activity beyond the original input. Here's the mechanism. When a new manufacturing plant opens in a small city, it hires workers directly. Those are your basic sector jobs, the ones that bring new money into the local economy from outside. Those workers now have paychecks. They spend money at local restaurants, pay rent, buy groceries, get haircuts. Those spending decisions support non-basic sector jobs, the service workers who depend on local consumer demand rather than external income. Those service workers in turn spend their wages locally, creating yet another round of economic activity. Each round is smaller than the last, but the cumulative effect is substantially larger than the original investment. This is the critical distinction the AP exam will test you on: basic sector jobs versus non-basic sector jobs. Basic sector jobs are the engine. They export goods or services outside the region and bring external dollars in. Non-basic sector jobs are the multiplier. They recirculate those dollars locally. Manufacturing, mining, military bases, and universities often serve as basic sector activities. Retail, healthcare services, and local government are typically non-basic. If you confuse these two on an FRQ, you'll lose points immediately, so lock that distinction in. The formula and how to use it. The multiplier itself has a formula you absolutely must know. The economic base multiplier is calculated as multiplier equals total employment divided by basic sector employment. So if a city has 50,000 total workers and 10,000 of them work in the basic sector, manufacturing, export-oriented industries, your multiplier is 5. That means every one basic sector job supports a total of 5 jobs in the local economy, the original basic job plus 4 non-basic jobs it indirectly sustains. On the AP exam, you might be given a scenario like this. A region has 20,000 basic sector jobs and a multiplier of 4. How many total jobs does the regional economy support? You flip the formula. Total employment equals multiplier times basic sector employment, giving you 80,000. Or you might be asked to find the non-basic sector jobs alone, which would be total employment minus basic sector employment, so 60,000 practice. All 3 versions of this calculation because the exam will test whichever version you least expect. Drawing and interpreting the economic base model. If you're asked to sketch a diagram related to the multiplier effect and economic base theory, picture a simple 2-sector circle or a flow diagram. Draw an arrow representing money flowing into the region from external markets. That's your basic sector activity. Then show that income circulating internally through multiple rounds of spending, with each arrow representing a round of non-basic economic activity. The key visual message is that internal circulation amplifies the original injection. You might also see this represented as a bar graph, where the total employment bar is notably taller than the basic employment bar, with the gap representing non-basic employment. Label your axis clearly: employment on the vertical axis, sectors on the horizontal, and always indicate which portion is basic and which is non-basic. Why some regions have higher multipliers. Here's where this connects beautifully to other parts of the course. A region's multiplier isn't fixed. It varies based on how self-contained and economically diverse the local economy is. A large, diversified metropolitan area like Chicago has a high multiplier because workers there can spend money on a wide variety of locally produced goods and services. A small, resource-dependent town in a peripheral region has a low multiplier because residents must import most of what they consume. Money flows out quickly to external markets rather than circulating locally. This connects directly to Wallerstein's world systems theory from earlier in Unit 7. Core regions tend to have higher multipliers because they have more diversified economies with robust non-basic sectors. Peripheral regions often see their multiplier effect leak out because they lack the local service infrastructure to capture those spending rounds. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. The exam loves to test a specific misconception. Students often assume that more basic sector jobs automatically means a bigger total economy, but that's only half the picture. What matters is the multiplier, how effectively the region converts basic sector activity into broader economic growth. A region with 5,000 basic jobs and a multiplier of 6 actually supports more total employment than a region with 8,000 basic jobs and a multiplier of 2. Always do the math and think about the full chain, not just the initial input. Another trap involves confusing the multiplier effect with agglomeration economies, which you studied earlier in Unit 7. Agglomeration is about the cost savings and efficiency gains from firms clustering together. The multiplier is specifically about how income circulates and generates additional employment rounds. These often reinforce each other. Agglomeration can raise a region's multiplier, but they are distinct mechanisms. On an FRQ that asks you to explain how a new auto plant drives regional growth, you earn points for correctly distinguishing between the direct job creation, the multiplier effect creating service jobs, and separately, any agglomeration effects attracting supplier firms. Also watch out for the concept of leakage. When workers spend their money on imported goods, online retailers outside the region, or pay taxes that flow to the federal government, those dollars leave the local economic circuit. That's leakage, and it reduces the effective multiplier. Regions with high leakage, often developing regions or small towns, see a dampened multiplier effect even with significant basic sector investment. Connections across the course. The multiplier effect ties together an impressive range of concepts. It connects to growth pole theory, the idea that investment in a specific sector or location can spark wider regional development, and to cumulative causation, where initial advantages compound over time. It relates back to Unit 1 concepts of uneven development and to Unit 6 discussions of urban economic structure. When you see questions about why some cities grew rapidly while nearby towns stagnated, the multiplier effect is almost always part of the answer. With the multiplier firmly in hand, you're ready to zoom out and look at the broader patterns of how development spreads, or sometimes doesn't spread, across entire world regions, which is exactly where we're headed next. 7.18 Gender and Development, Women in the Workforce. Let's talk about one of the most powerful yet underexplored forces in global economic development, the role of women in the workforce. If you've ever wondered why some countries seem to develop economically faster than others, or why certain regions remain stuck in cycles of poverty despite access to resources, gender equity in labor participation is often a central piece of that puzzle. And College Board knows it, which is why this topic shows up consistently on the AP exam, especially in FRQs that ask you to explain patterns of development. The core concept, gender and economic development, are inseparable. Here's the foundational idea you need to carry into the exam. A country's level of economic development is deeply tied to how well it integrates women into its workforce. Think of it like a rowing team. If half your crew refuses to row or is prevented from rowing, the boat is going to move a lot slower, no matter how talented the other half is. Nations that systematically exclude women from economic participation are, in effect, rowing with one arm. The United Nations and World Bank have repeatedly demonstrated that increasing female labor force participation correlates strongly with GDP growth, reduced fertility rates, improved child health outcomes, and greater political stability. This is not a moral argument the AP exam is asking you to make. It's an empirical, geographic, and economic one. You need to be able to explain why gender disparities exist, how they're measured, and what their effects are on development patterns. Key measurements: the Gender Inequality Index and beyond. The College Board expects you to know specific metrics. The most important is the Gender Inequality Index, GII, published by the United Nations Development Programme as part of the Human Development Report. The GII measures inequality between men and women across 3 dimensions: reproductive health, maternal mortality ratio and adolescent birth rate, empowerment, share of parliamentary seats and educational attainment, and labor market participation, female versus male labor force participation rate. A GII score of 0 means perfect equality. A score of 1 means maximum inequality. So when you see a country like Niger with a GII near 0.65, that tells you women face severe disadvantages across health, education, and employment. Compare that to Switzerland or Denmark with scores near 0.02, and you can immediately infer a dramatically different development context. You also need to know the Gender Development Index, GDI, which compares male and female Human Development Index scores. A GDI below 1.0 means women have a lower HDI than men in that country, which is true in most of the world. These 2 indices are related but distinct. The GII focuses on inequality and loss of human development due to gender disparity. The GDI focuses on the disparity in achieved development. Don't mix them up on the MCQ. A common trap question will describe a measurement and ask you to identify which index it describes. Why women enter or stay out of the workforce. Geography matters enormously here. In regions where subsistence agriculture dominates, women often perform tremendous amounts of unpaid agricultural labor that doesn't show up in official labor statistics. This is a classic MCQ trap. If a question tells you that women in sub-Saharan Africa have low formal labor force participation, that does not mean women are not working. It means their work is unpaid, informal, and uncounted in GDP calculations. The exam may ask you to identify which type of work accounts for this discrepancy, and the answer involves informal sector labor and subsistence agriculture. Cultural, religious, and political structures also shape women's workforce participation. In some regions, patriarchal norms restrict women's mobility, limit their access to education, or tie them to domestic labor. In countries where women have low literacy rates and limited access to secondary and post-secondary education, the pipeline into skilled formal employment narrows dramatically. This connects directly back to Unit 3 content on cultural landscapes and Unit 6's discussion of urban informal economies. You want to draw those threads explicitly in your FRQ responses to demonstrate geographic thinking. The demographic dividend connection. One of the most tested connections in this section links women's workforce participation to the demographic transition model from Unit 2. When women gain access to education and formal employment, fertility rates drop. This is not coincidental, it is causal. Educated women who participate in the workforce tend to delay marriage, have fewer children, and invest more resources per child. Countries that go through this transition enter what economists call a demographic dividend, a period where the working-age population is large relative to dependence, which supercharges economic growth. East Asian economies like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore leveraged exactly this dynamic in the latter half of the 20th century. And it's a go-to FRQ example you should have ready. Export processing zones and female labor. Here's a real-world example the exam loves. Export processing zones, EPZs, sometimes called special economic zones. These are designated areas common in countries like Bangladesh, Mexico, and Vietnam, where governments offer tax incentives and relaxed regulations to attract foreign manufacturing. A defining feature of EPZ labor forces is that they are disproportionately female, often 70 to 80% women. Why? Because factory owners in textile, garment, and electronics industries often prefer to hire women, viewing them as more compliant, detail-oriented, and less likely to unionize. This is a geographic pattern with enormous development implications. On one hand, EPZ employment pulls women into formal wage labor, increases household income, and raises female autonomy. On the other hand, working conditions are often exploitative, wages remain low, and the economic benefits primarily flow to multinational corporations and not the host country. The AP exam may ask you to evaluate this trade-off, and you should be able to articulate both sides with specific geographic examples. Common FRQ mistakes to avoid. When you write about gender and development in an FRQ, College Board is looking for precise geographic reasoning, not vague generalizations. Don't write women in poor countries don't work. Instead, write something like, in countries with low HDI scores and limited access to formal education, women are often confined to informal and subsistence labor that is not captured in official economic statistics, which artificially depresses measured female labor force participation rates. That's the kind of precision that earns rubric points. Also, always connect your answer to a named region, country, or index. Specificity is rewarded. Connecting to the bigger picture. This topic intersects with virtually every major theme in Unit 7. It connects to dependency theory, which argues global economic structures keep developing nations in subordinate roles, including by exploiting cheap female labor, to Wallerstein's world systems theory, core versus periphery, and to Rostow's stages of economic growth. When women gain access to microfinance, another favorite exam topic, they can initiate small enterprises that help a country's informal economy transition toward formal development. As you move into the next topic, keep in mind that understanding these gender dimensions of development will sharpen your analysis of global inequality patterns, because development is never just about resources or geography alone, it's always about who has access to opportunity and why. 7.19 Microfinance and Development Strategies. What is microfinance, and why does it matter? Imagine you want to start a small business, maybe selling vegetables at a local market, or buying a sewing machine to make clothes for your neighbors. You need about $200 to get started. For most people reading this, that's a manageable amount. But for a subsistence farmer in Bangladesh or a street vendor in Bolivia, that $200 might as well be $2 million. Traditional banks won't touch you if you have no collateral, no credit history, and no formal income. You're locked out of the formal financial system entirely, which means you're locked out of economic mobility. That's the exact problem microfinance was designed to solve. Microfinance refers to financial services, most commonly small loans called microcredit, but also savings accounts, insurance, and money transfers, provided to low-income individuals or communities who lack access to conventional banking. The foundational idea is deceptively simple. Give poor people access to small amounts of capital, and they can lift themselves out of poverty through entrepreneurship. The concept was popularized by economist Muhammad Yunus, who founded the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh in 1983. Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006, which tells you how seriously the international community took this idea. For the AP exam, you need to know Yunus and the Grameen Bank by name. They appear frequently in both MCQs and FRQs. How microfinance works in practice. The Grameen model introduced a brilliant structural innovation, group lending. Rather than lending to individuals, the bank lends to small groups, typically 5 to 8 people, often women in the same village. No individual in the group gets their next loan unless everyone in the group repays their current one. This creates what economists call social collateral. Your reputation within your community, your relationships, your neighbors' trust in you, these replace the physical collateral a bank would normally require. The peer pressure to repay is enormous, and repayment rates through Grameen-style lending have historically been around 95 to 98%, often higher than traditional bank loans. That's a staggering statistic, and it's one the College Board loves to test. You should also know that microfinance deliberately targets women in developing regions. This is not accidental. Research consistently shows that when women control household income, a greater percentage goes toward children's nutrition, education, and health, outcomes that compound over generations. This connects directly to the demographic transition model from Unit 2 and to indicators like the Human Development Index, which you studied in Unit 7's earlier sections. When women gain economic agency, fertility rates tend to decline, education rates rise, and communities develop more sustainably. The AP exam will often ask you to connect microfinance to broader development patterns, so always think in terms of these downstream effects. Microfinance within the broader development debate. Here's where you need to think critically, because the AP exam does not want you to treat microfinance as a magic solution. There are genuine critiques, and knowing them is what separates a 4 from a 5. Critics argue that interest rates on microcredit loans can be extremely high, sometimes exceeding 30 or 40% annually, because the administrative cost of managing thousands of tiny loans is proportionally greater than managing one large loan. This can trap borrowers in cycles of debt rather than liberating them. The AP exam may present a scenario where a borrower's situation worsened after taking a microloan, and you need to recognize that as a realistic outcome, not a trick question. Microfinance sits within a larger conversation about development strategies that you must understand holistically. The College Board organizes these strategies along a spectrum from top-down to bottom-up approaches. Top-down development comes from governments, international organizations like the World Bank or International Monetary Fund, or large multinational corporations. Think of large infrastructure projects, a dam, a highway, an industrial park, funded by foreign aid or international loans. These can generate growth but often fail to reach the poorest communities and can create dependency. Bottom-up development, by contrast, starts at the community level, empowering local people with the tools, skills, and capital to drive their own economic improvement. Microfinance is the quintessential bottom-up strategy. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are the institutional vehicle most often associated with bottom-up development, and you need to be comfortable using that term precisely. Connections to other units and key vocabulary. When the AP exam asks about development strategies, it's rarely asking about just one concept in isolation. Microfinance connects to the Brandt line, which you know from earlier in Unit 7 as the rough geographic divide separating the wealthy global north from the less developed global south. Microfinance programs are almost exclusively deployed south of that line. It connects to Rostow's stages of economic growth, because microfinance theoretically helps communities move from the traditional society, or preconditions for takeoff stage, by seeding entrepreneurial activity. It also connects to Wallerstein's world systems theory, which frames global inequality as a structural feature of the capitalist world economy, with core nations extracting value from periphery and semi-periphery nations. A Wallerstein-influenced critic would argue that microfinance tinkers at the margins without addressing those structural power imbalances. Expect the AP exam to give you a quote or scenario and ask you to identify which theoretical framework it represents. Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. The most common trap on microfinance MCQs is confusing microfinance with foreign aid. They are not the same thing. Foreign aid is a transfer of money, goods, or services given from one government or international body to another, often with no expectation of repayment in the traditional sense. Microfinance involves loans that must be repaid, typically with interest, making it a market-based mechanism rather than a charitable one. Students who haven't drawn this distinction clearly will choose the wrong answer when given options that blend the two. Another trap involves the target demographic. The exam may list men as the primary recipients of Grameen-style microloans, which is incorrect. The program specifically targets women, and the rationale for that targeting, development outcomes, household spending patterns, is fair game for an FRQ. For FRQ scoring, if a prompt asks you to explain a bottom-up development strategy, simply naming microfinance earns minimal credit. To earn full rubric points, you need to explain the mechanism, how it works, why it empowers individuals, what structural problem it addresses, and connect it to a measurable development outcome. Practice building those three-part responses: name it, explain the process, link it to consequence. As you move forward in your review, you'll see how these development strategies, microfinance, foreign aid, fair trade, and others, all represent different philosophies about how change happens and who gets to drive it. That philosophical tension is exactly what the next topics will continue to unpack. 7.20 International Organizations and Development. IMF, World Bank, WTO. The three pillars of global economic order. All right, settle in, because this topic is one of those areas where students consistently lose points, not because the material is complicated, but because they mix up three organizations that sound vaguely similar. Think of the IMF, World Bank, and WTO as three very different doctors treating the same patient, the global economy, but each with a completely different specialty and set of tools. Once that analogy clicks, everything else becomes much easier to sort out. Let's start with the big picture. After World War II, the international community looked at the wreckage of global trade and finance and said, "We need rules." The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 established the foundational architecture for post-war economic cooperation, and out of that conference came the IMF and what eventually became the World Bank. The WTO came later, in 1995, replacing the older GATT framework. All three are intergovernmental organizations, meaning sovereign nations voluntarily join and agree to operate within their frameworks. That word voluntary matters enormously on the AP exam, because these are not governing bodies, they're cooperative institutions. The International Monetary Fund, IMF. Think of the IMF as the emergency room of global finance. When a country is experiencing a currency crisis, a balance of payments crisis, or is simply hemorrhaging foreign reserves, the IMF steps in with short-term loans and financial stabilization packages. Its primary mandate is monetary stability, keeping the international monetary system functioning so that trade and investment can flow without catastrophic disruption. Here's where you need to be precise for the exam. The IMF does not fund development projects like roads or schools. It funds financial stabilization. When Argentina faced economic collapse in the early 2000s, or when Greece experienced its debt crisis in the 2010s, the IMF provided conditional lending loans attached to structural adjustment conditions. Those conditions typically involve austerity measures, currency reforms, and market liberalization policies. This is critically important. IMF loans come with strings attached, and on the AP exam, you need to know that those conditions often require recipient countries to reduce government spending, privatize state enterprises, and deregulate markets. Critics argue these conditions worsen inequality and harm vulnerable populations. That tension between financial stabilization and social impact is a rich source of FRQ material. The World Bank. If the IMF is the emergency room, the World Bank is the long-term rehabilitation clinic. The World Bank's mission is economic development and poverty reduction, and it does this primarily by funding long-term infrastructure and development projects in lower-income countries. Think dams, highways, schools, hospitals, electrification projects, the physical and institutional capital that enables economic growth over decades. The World Bank actually consists of two main institutions that you should know by name: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which lends to middle-income countries at near-market rates, and the International Development Association, IDA, which provides concessional loans and grants to the world's poorest countries. You won't usually need to distinguish these two on the exam, but knowing the World Bank has this dual structure shows conceptual depth on an FRQ. The most common trap on multiple-choice questions is confusing the IMF and World Bank. Ask yourself this question: is the problem a financial crisis happening right now, or is the problem long-term underdevelopment? Crisis equals IMF, development equals World Bank. If a question describes a country with a depreciating currency and shrinking reserves seeking emergency assistance, that's the IMF. If a question describes a country seeking funds to build a hydroelectric dam or expand rural healthcare, that's the World Bank. The World Trade Organization, WTO. Now we shift from finance to trade, and the WTO is a fundamentally different kind of institution. Where the IMF and World Bank lend money, the WTO establishes and enforces the rules of international trade. It's the referee of global commerce, providing a forum for trade negotiations, a framework of agreements that member nations must follow, and a dispute resolution mechanism for when countries accuse each other of unfair trade practices. The WTO operates on several key principles you should internalize. The Most Favored Nation (MFN) principle states that any trade advantage a country grants to one member must be extended to all members. You can't play favorites. The National Treatment Principle means that once goods enter a country, they must be treated the same as domestically produced goods. Together, these principles push toward a level playing field in international trade. The WTO also addresses tariffs, subsidies, intellectual property, and services through various agreements, the most famous being TRIPS, Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights, and GATS, General Agreement on Trade and Services. Here's a conceptual nuance that trips students up. The WTO promotes free trade, but free trade is not universally beneficial in the short term. When trade barriers fall, some domestic industries face competition they cannot withstand, leading to deindustrialization in certain regions. This connects directly back to Unit 7's core themes of uneven development and the core periphery model. Peripheral countries sometimes argue the WTO's rules favor core countries that already have competitive industries, locking developing nations into exporting raw materials while importing manufactured goods, a critique rooted in dependency theory which you studied earlier in this unit. Connections to other units and exam strategy. These three organizations connect to an astonishing range of topics across the course. When you think about global supply chains and commodity chains from Unit 7, the WTO's trade rules are the legal scaffolding holding those chains together. When you consider why some countries remain stuck in subsistence agriculture or primary sector production, World Bank lending priorities and IMF structural adjustment conditions are part of that story. Development indicators like the Human Development Index, GDP per capita, and gender inequality measures that you studied earlier become the metrics used to justify and evaluate these organizations' interventions. On the FRQ, if you're asked to evaluate the role of international organizations in development, you need to present both the intended benefits and the documented critiques. Simply saying the World Bank helps poor countries will not score full points. You need to show that conditional lending can entrench dependency, that structural adjustment has historically increased short-term poverty even while stabilizing economies, and that WTO rules have been criticized for protecting wealthy country agricultural subsidies while demanding developing nations open their markets. That nuanced, two-sided analysis is exactly what the rubric rewards. One more boundary condition worth noting: regional trade agreements like NAFTA or the EU exist alongside the WTO, not in opposition to it. The WTO actually permits these regional arrangements under certain conditions. Don't confuse regional economic blocs with the WTO itself. They're related but distinct levels of economic integration. As you move into the final stretch of Unit 7, you'll bring everything together, these organizations, development theories, and economic indicators, to understand the spatial patterns of industrial and economic development that define our modern world. 7.21 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and Environmental Considerations. Setting the stage. What are the SDGs? Picture this: it's 2015, and representatives from 193 countries gather at the United Nations and essentially agree on a shared to-do list for humanity. Not a wish list, an actual framework with deadlines, measurable targets, and global buy-in. That's exactly what the Sustainable Development Goals are. The SDGs replaced the earlier Millennium Development Goals and gave the world 17 specific goals to achieve by 2030. For the AP exam, you need to understand not just what the SDGs are, but why they exist, how they connect to development theory, and how environmental considerations shape economic decisions at every scale. The SDGs cover an enormous range of concerns: ending poverty, Goal 1, zero hunger, Goal 2, quality education, Goal 4, gender equality, Goal 5, clean water and sanitation, Goal 6, affordable clean energy, Goal 7, decent work and economic growth, Goal 8, Reduced Inequalities, Goal 10, Sustainable Cities, Goal 11, Climate Action, Goal 13, Life Below Water, Goal 14, Life on Land, Goal 15, and more. You don't need to memorize all 17 numbers, but you absolutely need to recognize that the SDGs reflect a holistic view of development, one that rejects the idea that economic growth alone equals progress. That conceptual shift is huge, and the AP exam loves to test it. Sustainable development, the core concept. The phrase sustainable development comes from the 1987 Brundtland Report, which defined it as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Think of it like a savings account. You can withdraw money to fund today's needs, but if you drain the entire account, your children inherit nothing. Sustainable development asks us to spend wisely, preserve the principle, and grow in ways that don't destroy the very systems we depend on. This is where the three pillars of sustainability come in: economic, social, and environmental, sometimes visualized as three overlapping circles or as a Venn diagram. The AP exam may ask you to interpret this diagram. True sustainability only exists where all three circles overlap. If a factory creates jobs, economic win, but poisons a river, environmental loss, and forces workers into unsafe conditions, social loss, it is not sustainable development, even if GDP rises. Be very precise about this on the exam. Economic growth is not synonymous with sustainable development. That is one of the most common traps in multiple choice questions. Environmental considerations and development patterns. Here's where it gets juicy for Unit 7. As countries industrialize and move through development stages, their environmental footprint changes dramatically. You'll want to connect this to the environmental Kuznets curve, which describes an inverted U relationship between income per capita and environmental degradation. Early in industrialization, pollution rises sharply, think 19th century London or China's rapid industrial boom in the early 2000s. But as a country grows wealthier, it gains the resources and public pressure to invest in cleaner technologies and stronger regulations, and environmental quality eventually improves. Visualize this as a hill. On the left side, GDP rises and pollution rises together. At the peak, you hit maximum degradation. On the right downslope, income keeps rising, but pollution falls. For the exam, know how to sketch this curve with income on the x-axis and environmental degradation on the y-axis. The critical AP trap here is assuming the curve is automatic or inevitable. It isn't. Countries don't naturally slide down the right side without policy intervention, social pressure, or access to cleaner alternatives. Wealthier countries also sometimes export their pollution by outsourcing dirty industries to lower-income countries, which is a concept known as the pollution haven hypothesis. If a free response question asks you to evaluate whether a country has achieved sustainable development, mentioning this curve and its limitations will earn you nuance points. Connecting SDGs to development models. The SDGs don't exist in a vacuum. They're in constant conversation with the development models you studied earlier in Unit 7. Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth, for instance, assumes that all countries will industrialize along a similar path, moving from traditional society through takeoff to a mass consumption society. The SDGs fundamentally challenge this model by asking, what if the mass consumption endpoint is ecologically unsustainable? Can every country on Earth consume resources at the rate the United States does? The answer, according to ecological footprint analysis, is a firm no. We would need multiple Earths. Wallerstein's world systems theory adds another layer here. Core countries, the wealthy, industrialized global north, have historically extracted resources from periphery countries, the developing global south, leaving those regions with environmental degradation, resource depletion, and economic dependency. The SDGs are partly a response to this imbalance, and AP exam FRQs sometimes ask you to use a specific theoretical lens to analyze development. If you're asked about SDGs through the lens of dependency theory or world systems theory, argue that achieving the SDGs requires structural changes in the global economy, not just individual country-level reforms. Common misconceptions and MCQ traps. Let's talk about the traps you'll actually encounter on test day. First, don't confuse the SDGs with the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, which ran from 2000 to 2015. The SDGs are broader, apply to all countries, not just developing ones, and have more explicit environmental components. Second, sustainable development is not the same as environmentalism. Sustainability explicitly includes economic growth and social equity. Neglecting either pillar makes development unsustainable. Third, don't assume that renewable energy automatically means sustainable development. If a wind farm displaces indigenous communities without consent, it fails the social pillar and violates SDG 10, reduced inequalities, and SDG 16, peace, justice, strong institutions. For FRQ responses, the College Board rewards specificity. Saying the SDGs promote development earns nothing. Saying SDG 7, affordable clean energy, supports development in sub-Saharan Africa by reducing energy poverty, which in turn enables economic productivity and reduces indoor air pollution linked to biomass burning, earns full points. Practice connecting a specific SDG to a specific mechanism in a specific region. Cross-unit connections. The SDGs thread through nearly every unit of AP Human Geography. In Unit 2, Population and Migration, you'll connect SDG 3, Good Health and Well-Being, to Demographic Transition Theory. In Unit 4, Political Patterns, SDG 16, links to Governance, Quality, and Territorial Control. In Unit 5, Agriculture, SDG 2, Zero Hunger, connects directly to food security debates and agricultural industrialization. In Unit 6, Cities, SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, ties to urban planning, informal settlements, and smart growth. Never treat the SDGs as an isolated topic. They are the connective tissue of the entire course's development conversation. As you master the SDGs, you've built exactly the foundation you need for the broader environmental geography questions that will appear throughout the exam, and that foundation leads us perfectly into discussing how specific industrial and agricultural practices shape landscapes and communities at the local, regional, and global scale. 7.22 Tourism and its role in economic development. Why tourism matters in economic geography. Let's talk about tourism, and I don't mean just picking a vacation spot. In AP Human Geography, tourism is one of the most powerful lenses through which we understand how places develop economically, how global money flows between the core and periphery, and how culture and environment become commodities. If you've ever wondered why a tiny island nation like the Maldives can sustain a modern economy, or why Caribbean countries seem perpetually caught between prosperity and dependence, tourism is a huge part of the answer. Tourism is formally defined as travel for recreational, leisure, cultural, or business purposes, and the tourism industry encompasses all the services that support those travelers: hotels, restaurants, transportation, entertainment, and local crafts. But here's what the AP exam really wants you to understand. Tourism is not just an industry. It is a development strategy, and like all development strategies, it comes with trade-offs. Tourism as an economic development tool. Think of tourism the way you'd think about any export. When a tourist from Germany flies to Jamaica and spends money at a resort, Germany is effectively importing Jamaica's sunshine, beaches, and culture. That spending generates foreign exchange revenue, hard currency flowing into a developing country, which is exactly what peripheral and semi-peripheral nations need to fund imports, service debt, and invest in infrastructure. This makes tourism one of the primary economic activities in the tertiary sector services, and it connects directly to your Unit 7 framework around Rostow's stages of economic growth and Wallerstein's world systems theory. A country using tourism to climb out of the traditional society stage is using comparative advantage, the same principle you learned about in trade theory. The multiplier effect is critical here, and it almost always appears on the AP exam in some form. When a tourist spends $1 at a local restaurant, that dollar doesn't just disappear. The restaurant owner pays staff, buys produce from local farmers, and pays rent to a local landlord, each of whom then spends that money again. The original dollar ripples through the local economy multiple times, amplifying its impact. The formula you need to know is multiplier equals 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, where MPC is the marginal propensity to consume locally. The higher the share of income spent within the local economy, the larger the multiplier. This is where the AP exam loves to test you on edge cases, specifically what happens when that multiplier shrinks. The leakage problem and dependency. Here is the trap that catches so many students. Tourism sounds like an obvious win for developing countries, and so students instinctively answer that tourism always benefits host economies, but the AP exam will absolutely test you on economic leakage, and this is where your answer has to get more nuanced. Leakage occurs when tourism revenue flows back out of the local economy, rather than circulating within it. Imagine a resort in Mexico owned by a multinational hotel chain, headquartered in the United States. The profits go to shareholders abroad. The food is imported from global suppliers, and the management staff are expatriates. The local community provides labor, often low-wage, seasonal, and informal, but little of the tourists' money stays in Mexico. This is the dependency trap, and it ties directly back to Wallerstein's core periphery model. The peripheral country is supplying the raw material, its natural environment and culture, while the core extracts the profit. Sound familiar? It's the same structure as colonial resource extraction, just dressed up in beach umbrellas. When you're answering an FRQ on tourism's role in development, you must address both the benefits and the leakage problem to earn full rubric points. A one-sided answer, either tourism is great or tourism is exploitative, will cost you scoring opportunities. The College Board rewards geographic complexity. Enclave tourism and its consequences. A concept directly connected to leakage is enclave tourism, which the AP exam treats as a specific identifiable model. Enclave tourism describes resort developments that are spatially and economically isolated from surrounding communities, gated resorts, all-inclusive cruise ship ports, or private island retreats. Tourists arrive, spend money entirely within the enclave, and leave without meaningfully engaging with or benefiting the broader local economy. The physical geography of the enclave reinforces the economic separation. This matters for FRQ responses because when you're asked to explain why tourism hasn't led to broad development in a specific country, enclave tourism is often the geographic answer. Ecotourism and sustainable development. The AP exam also expects you to understand ecotourism as a proposed alternative development model. Ecotourism emphasizes travel to natural environments with the goal of conservation, community benefit, and minimal environmental impact. Costa Rica is the textbook example, and I mean that literally. It appears in virtually every AP human geography textbook. Costa Rica leveraged its biodiversity and rainforests to attract high-spending tourists, reinvested that revenue into conservation and education, and built a development model that reduced leakage by keeping tourism locally managed. The key distinction the exam tests is between ecotourism done well, where money stays local and environments are protected, and greenwashing, where resorts simply market themselves as eco while practicing the same extractive enclave model. Don't let the label fool you, and don't let it fool your exam answers either. Graphs, models, and what you need to draw. While tourism doesn't have one single graph the way supply-demand does, you should be comfortable drawing and interpreting a basic economic leakage diagram. Picture a flowchart. Tourist spending enters a destination economy, a portion circulates locally, the retained revenue, and a portion leaks out through imports, foreign-owned profits, and expatriate wages. The smaller the retained revenue circle, the lower the development benefit. If an FRQ asks you to illustrate tourism's economic impact, this diagram communicates sophistication quickly. You should also be ready to interpret development indicators in relation to tourism-dependent economies, GDP per capita, HDI scores, and employment data. Tourism-dependent countries often show high GDP, but also high inequality, which is itself an AP vocabulary term, uneven development. That's a connection to Unit 7's broader themes around development disparities. Common MCQ traps to avoid. The most frequent wrong answer trap is assuming that high tourism arrivals automatically mean high development benefits. Look for answer choices that distinguish between gross revenue and net retained revenue. Another trap involves confusing ecotourism with any outdoor tourism. Ecotourism specifically requires community benefit and conservation goals. And watch out for questions that conflate the multiplier effect with automatic economic growth. The multiplier only works when leakage is low. Connections across units. Tourism connects beautifully to Unit 3, cultural landscapes and commodification of culture. Unit 5, population movement and migration of labor toward tourist centers, and Unit 6, urban development and the transformation of cities into tourist destinations. It also ties to the concept of sense of place when tourism commodifies a location's identity. That location may experience cultural erosion, a concept the AP exam tests under cultural diffusion and acculturation. With tourism's role in development firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to zoom out and examine the broader patterns of global inequality and the institutional frameworks like the IMF and World Bank that attempt to shape development trajectories at the international scale. 7.23 Post-industrial economies and the service sector. The Great Economic Transformation. Let's start with a story you already know. Imagine your great-grandparents' world, factories belching smoke across Pittsburgh, steel mills lighting up the Ohio River Valley at night, men filing into plants by the thousands to make things with their hands. Now fast forward to today, those same cities might have a hospital complex, a university research park, a cluster of tech startups, and a downtown full of restaurants and boutique shops. The factories are largely gone. What happened to that transformation? from making things to providing services and knowledge is exactly what we mean by a post-industrial economy, and it is absolutely central to what College Board expects you to know for the AP exam. A post-industrial economy is one in which the dominant economic activities have shifted away from manufacturing and raw material extraction toward service industries, knowledge work, and information technology. The term was popularized by sociologist Daniel Bell in the 1970s, and you should know it as a defining characteristic of more developed countries, MDCs like the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, and most of Western Europe. The key shift is from secondary sector activities, the factories and fabrication, toward tertiary, quaternary, and quinary sector activities. Breaking down the sectors. This is where many students get tripped up, so let's be precise. The tertiary sector covers retail trade, transportation, personal services, and hospitality, essentially anything where you're providing a service rather than making a product. Think of your barista, your Uber driver, or the cashier at Target. The quaternary sector involves information processing, research, finance, and education. The knowledge economy. A software engineer writing code, a financial analyst at Goldman Sachs, a professor at a research university, these are quaternary workers. Some geographers carve out a quinary sector for the highest level decision-making roles. CEOs, government officials, top scientists, and consultants who shape the direction of industries themselves. For the AP exam, you need to know all three of these and be able to distinguish them from each other with specific examples. Here's the analogy that makes this click. Think of it as a restaurant. The farmer growing the wheat is primary sector. The factory turning that wheat into pasta is secondary. The waiter serving your pasta is tertiary. The restaurant's marketing director managing the brand is quaternary. And the executive team deciding whether to open 100 new locations is quinary. One meal, 5 sectors of the economy. Why post-industrialism happens. Deindustrialization. The force that drives post-industrial transition is called deindustrialization, the decline of manufacturing employment as a share of total employment. This happens for a few interconnected reasons. First, technological automation means factories can produce more with fewer workers. Second, and critically for AP Human Geography, globalization allows manufacturing to relocate to regions with lower labor costs, a process called offshoring when a company moves production abroad, or outsourcing when it contracts that work to an external firm. Both concepts appear regularly on the exam, and you must not confuse them. Offshoring is specifically about geographic relocation to another country. Outsourcing is about contracting work to a third party, which may or may not involve crossing a border. As manufacturing jobs left cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Baltimore throughout the late 20th century, those areas became part of what geographers call the manufacturing belt, or more pointedly, the Rust Belt, a region whose industrial infrastructure became obsolete. This term is one College Board loves to test, and you should be able to identify the Rust Belt on a map of the United States and explain its causes using the vocabulary above. The rise of edge cities and new economic landscapes. Post-industrial economies don't just change what people do for work, they reshape urban geography entirely. As service and knowledge industries grew, economic activity dispersed from traditional downtowns into edge cities, large nodes of commercial and office development on the suburban fringe of major metropolitan areas. Geographer Joel Garreau, who coined the term, described edge cities as places with more office space than most traditional downtowns, more retail than most regional malls, and more jobs than residents. Tyson's Corner outside Washington, D.C., or the Galleria area outside Houston are classic examples. On the AP exam, edge cities connect directly to Unit 6 content on urban structure and suburbanization. This is a cross-unit connection you should absolutely flag and use in FRQ responses. Comparative development and the sector model. For the AP exam, you must be able to interpret a diagram showing how the share of employment across sectors changes as a country develops. Picture a graph with level of development, often proxied by GDP per capita on the horizontal axis and percentage of the workforce on the vertical axis. 3 curves trace the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors over time. In low-income countries, the primary sector dominates as development proceeds. The secondary sector rises sharply while primary falls. In highly developed post-industrial economies, the tertiary sector ultimately claims the largest share, often above 70 to 80%, while both primary and secondary decline. The United States today has roughly 80% of its workforce in service sector employment. You should be able to draw this model, label the axes, and explain what each curve represents. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. Here's where students lose points. The most common trap is confusing offshoring with outsourcing. Remember, offshoring is geographic, outsourcing is organizational. A second trap is assuming that post-industrial economies have eliminated manufacturing entirely. They haven't. Manufacturing still exists, but it employs a far smaller proportion of the workforce, and much of what remains tends to be high-value, technology-intensive production. A third trap involves newly industrialized countries, NICs, like China, South Korea, and Mexico. These countries are in the rapid secondary sector growth phase of that developmental model. They are not post-industrial, but they are absorbing the manufacturing that MDCs shed. Mixing up NICs with post-industrial societies is a guaranteed wrong answer. For FRQ responses, College Board rubrics reward precise sector vocabulary. Don't just say service jobs, say tertiary sector employment or quaternary sector knowledge work, and pair it with a specific example. If a prompt asks you to explain how economic restructuring affects urban areas, connect deindustrialization to Rust Belt decline, then connect the growth of services to edge city formation and gentrification in former industrial zones. That chain of reasoning earns full rubric credit. Connections across the course. Post-industrial economies link outward across virtually every unit. In Unit 5 on agriculture, you see the primary sector shrinking as mechanization reduces farm employment. In Unit 6 on cities, deindustrialization explains urban decline and the hollow city phenomenon, while service growth drives gentrification and edge city sprawl. In Unit 7 itself, this topic connects directly to Wallerstein's world systems theory. Post-industrial MDCs function as the core, exporting capital and consuming manufactured goods produced in semi-peripheral and peripheral nations. Understanding post-industrial economies is really understanding the engine beneath so much of what you've studied all year, which makes the next topic, global economic development and its uneven consequences, a natural and essential next step. 7.24 Technology, Innovation, and the Digital Economy. Let's talk about something that fundamentally changed the rules of economic geography, the digital revolution. If classical location theory from Weber and von Thunen was about the tyranny of distance, the digital economy is largely about the collapse of that tyranny, and understanding exactly how that collapse happened, where it's still incomplete, and what new inequalities it's created is precisely what College Board wants you to demonstrate on your AP exam. The core concept, technology as a transformative force. Start with this foundational idea. Technology and innovation don't just improve existing economic systems. They restructure the entire spatial logic of production, trade, and development. Think of it like this. For centuries, if you wanted to manufacture something, you needed to be near raw materials, near labor, near transportation corridors. Weber's least cost theory was essentially a map of those constraints. Then along came containerization, fiber optic cables, satellite communications, and the internet, and suddenly some of those constraints evaporated almost overnight. Others didn't, and that distinction is critical for your exam. Defining the digital economy. The digital economy refers to economic activity that relies on digital technologies, including the production and sale of digital goods and services, e-commerce platforms, data analytics, cloud computing, and digitally enabled supply chain management. College Board also expects you to understand the broader category of knowledge economies, economies where the primary inputs are intellectual capital, information, and expertise rather than raw materials or manual labor. High-income countries like the United States, Germany, South Korea, and Japan have increasingly shifted toward knowledge economies, while many lower-income countries are still in earlier stages of that transition. This connects directly back to Rostow's stages of economic growth, which you studied earlier in Unit 7. The drive to maturity and age of high mass consumption stages both involve significant movement towards service and knowledge sectors. When you see an FRQ asking you to connect development indicators to economic stage, technology adoption rates, and digital infrastructure are legitimate pieces of evidence. Technology gaps and the digital divide. Here's where the geography gets rich and exam relevant. The digital divide describes the unequal access to digital technologies, hardware, software, internet connectivity, and digital literacy between and within countries. Think of it as a two-level problem. At the global scale, there's a divide between the global north and global south, where high-income countries have dramatically higher rates of broadband access, smartphone penetration, and digital financial inclusion. At the local scale, there are divides within countries, between urban and rural areas, between wealthy and low-income neighborhoods, between different demographic groups by age and education level. The exam loves to test whether you understand that the digital divide isn't just about hardware. It's also about infrastructure, Fiber optic cables, cell towers, reliable electricity, affordability, can households actually pay for data plans, digital literacy skills to use the technology effectively, and relevant content, is there local language, locally useful information online? These 4 dimensions together explain why simply dropping smartphones into a community doesn't automatically generate economic development, a trap answer you'll see on MCQs. Innovation hubs and agglomeration in the knowledge economy. Even as the digital economy theoretically allows work to happen anywhere, in practice knowledge industries cluster. This is one of the most important apparent paradoxes you need to be able to explain. Silicon Valley, the Research Triangle in North Carolina, Bangalore in India, Shenzhen in China, Zhongguancun in Beijing, these are all examples of technopoles, clusters of technology-based industries that form because of agglomeration economies. Talented workers want to be near other talented workers. Venture capital concentrates where startups are. Universities spin off companies that stay nearby. Supply chains for tech components become localized. The result is that high-value knowledge work is actually more spatially concentrated than traditional manufacturing in many ways, not less. This is a common MCQ trap. Students assume digitization means economic dispersion, but the evidence shows the opposite for high-value work. Low-value digital tasks like data entry, content moderation, and customer service can be offshored to lower-wage regions, think call centers in the Philippines or India. But high-value innovation work clusters intensely. Be ready to distinguish between these 2 patterns. Offshoring, outsourcing, and the new international division of labor. The digital economy accelerated what geographers call the new international division of labor, the reorganization of production across the globe enabled by telecommunications and transportation improvements. Multinational corporations can now coordinate complex production networks across dozens of countries in real time. A pharmaceutical company might do its R&D in Switzerland, manufacture in Ireland, handle legal work in Singapore, and run customer support from South Africa. This isn't just cost minimization the way Weber imagined it, it's a sophisticated spatial strategy enabled entirely by digital connectivity. For your FRQ responses, when you're asked to explain how globalization has changed economic geography, you should be able to link technological innovation explicitly to the fragmentation of production chains, the rise of service offshoring, and the creation of global cities as command and control nodes in the world economy. That last point connects to Friedman's world city hypothesis from earlier in Unit 7. E-commerce, platform economies, and retail geography. The rise of e-commerce has had dramatic effects on retail geography that appear frequently in AP exam questions. As companies like Amazon restructured retail, physical retail stores declined, particularly in suburban malls, while fulfillment centers and last-mile logistics hubs appeared in strategic locations near highway interchanges and dense population centers. The spatial logic here is almost Weber-like. Instead of minimizing transport costs to market, these distribution centers minimize delivery time to consumers. Understanding this shift helps you answer questions about deindustrialization of retail, changes in urban land use, and the geography of logistics employment. Exam, critical connections, and common traps. Let's consolidate the most dangerous misconceptions. First, don't confuse correlation with causation when it comes to technology and development. Access to mobile banking, like M-Pesa in Kenya, correlates with economic improvement, but the exam may ask you to explain the mechanism, not just note the correlation. Second, remember that technology adoption follows an S-curve diffusion pattern, slow at first, then rapid, then plateauing, which is the same spatial diffusion logic from Hegerstrand's diffusion model in Unit 3. Third, always distinguish between process innovation, new ways to make things, and product innovation, new things to make, since both have different geographic implications for labor markets. For FRQ scoring, College Board rewards students who can explain geographic patterns with precise vocabulary. Writing that technology reduces friction of distance earns more points than saying, technology makes things easier, and whenever a question asks about inequality, connecting the digital divide to existing patterns of core periphery relationships from world systems theory will consistently earn you analytical credit. As you move forward, you'll see how these patterns of technological development and economic restructuring manifest in the very fabric of cities themselves, which sets us up perfectly to explore how industrial and post-industrial change has reshaped urban landscapes.